Thank you to our interpreters for agreeing to interpret this entire meeting. Before we get started, I would love to start off with a tribal land acknowledgement, which I'm happy to provide. Renee, you're also with us, and if you would like to, I welcome you to provide the tribal land acknowledgement as well. So I'll just pause to see if you're available. Otherwise, I'm happy to do it.
Sure, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
And all the ones that came before and all the little ones to come. We live on the homelands of the Ute, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, the Shoshone, the Lakota, the Kiowa, the Comanche, the Navajo, the Chickasaw. What does it look like for next ancestor, not just the disproportionately active?
Thank you, Renee. It was a little bit hard to hear you at the end, but thank you for providing that tribal land acknowledgement. And I think we didn't hear the very last sentence of that, and just especially for our interpreters, several of the tribes that were outlined and mentioned, these are the tribes of the original stewards of these natural areas. And we obviously want to take a moment to honor and respect these stewards of the environment and the relationship they have with the land in the state that we now call Colorado. Okay, so with that, let's dive into our agenda here. You all saw some materials that I sent out yesterday. I know this was a long document, basically a third almost of the task force recommendations. We have a 4-hour meeting today, which may seem long, but as we were kind of parsing out the agenda and thinking through what exactly we need to talk about, it's actually not that much time, believe it or not. So we're going to have to be super efficient with our agenda today, and hopefully can get through all of this. Just please keep in mind as I'm presenting information about the environmental equity and cumulative impacts analyses, that these ideas primarily came from you all, task force members, obviously with input from members of the public through public comment, as well as through agency feedback. One thing I just want to be very clear about is that during this 4-hour meeting, and just a little side note that this is possibly our last subcommittee meeting. We will have some really big meetings coming up here on October 24th and 25th in Greeley. That meeting location has been chosen, has been updated in the calendar invitation. But I will send out more information specifically about that meeting, including an agenda next week. But that said, we are meeting today to talk about the equity analysis. As you probably remember, we ran out of time to have a complete discussion about this section of the recommendations at the last full task force meeting that we had in Grant Junction. And that's totally okay, because we have dedicated a lot of time to talking about this at past meetings, but it also means we have our work cut out for us today, and we really need to focus on adding as much specificity as possible to ensure that the details are clear and specific enough for you all to make a final vote in just a few weeks here. It is October 12th. The deadline for these recommendations, as a reminder, is November 14th. So we are just about a month out. And so, when we're talking about the final vote, we're really thinking about the audience for the recommendations. As a reminder, the audience being the legislature, the governor's office, and agencies. And we want to make sure that they're able to understand what the recommendations mean in order to implement them. Also keep in mind that if you have views that differ from what you're currently seeing in the recommendations, or you would like for language to be changed, this is the time to kind of share that. We've heard some questions from you all about how such an equity analysis would be completed or who it would apply to. now is the time to really voice your opinion and have conversations on that who, what, where, when, why, how of the equity analysis. And I'd really just like to reiterate that these are decisions that are for you all task force members to make. Us as staff, we are here to create structure and to help move the conversation along, but these ideas are not coming from us. And we know that it's really hard to make decisions about such complex topics. And if you don't feel like you have enough information to make a decision, especially with regard to whether and how the equity analysis should be applied, and like to what agencies, just please say so directly during this meeting. This is really your chance to speak up and explain why you need more information, what that information is, and that really will better equip us as staff to get that information to you by the October meeting in Greeley. One other big picture topic we have discussed in past meetings is the need to consider funding implications and priorities. Just remember that you all as task force members can make recommendations that require state agencies to spend money. But in doing so, you all should just really consider where the funding should come from and try to keep in mind that the scale of the costs involved. Where costs are large, you should think about priorities. So telling future readers which recommendations or aspects of the recommendations are top priorities for agencies to act on right away, as opposed to something that can wait a little longer in the future when funding might become available. So, I just want to reiterate, I know this is a challenging topic and conversation. It is so complex. We really invite every single one of you to conduct the conversation with an open mind in a way that is really respectful to one another. You all have been working together for months, and that work has really built a foundation of trust. And so we just ask that you assume the best in one another, ask questions rather than pointing fingers. If you are to disagree with somebody, focus on disagreeing on the idea that they might be presenting rather than the person or the organization that they represent. And there's obviously nothing wrong with this disagreement. I mean, you all were handpicked to be on this task force specifically because you represent a really wide range of views and backgrounds and agencies and come from different parts of Colorado. But really the only way to have an efficient conversation and get through this really large volume of material we need to discuss today is by having a conversation that focuses on the ideas that are on the page, rather than, focusing on the person that's proposing them or what organization they come from. Also, I just want to reiterate that what we're doing here is making recommendations. I know that's a very obvious thing to state, but the report we are crafting is not going to directly lead to policy change. These are recommendations that can and hopefully will influence policy change, but they are recommendations at the end of the day. And some of the recommendations are now at a level of specificity that will really be easy for agencies to implement if you ultimately vote in favor of them. Others are going to require much more detail, and we need to talk through that. And again, there's no requirement that you guys come to consensus on every single idea. And of course, there will be ideas you have discussed in the past few months that may not end up making it to the final recommendation, but that's okay. And it's our role as staff to really just hear your guys' ideas, hear what you want in the report, what you don't want in the report. So I just wanted to provide a little bit of framing there. I know that was kind of a lot, but just to kind of get us grounded in this space before we just jump into looking at this line by line. Let's really think about kind of our purpose here, and let's think about really as we're looking at these recommendations. At this point, we're starting to wordsmith, right? We're starting to really look at, okay, what's on the page, and what language needs to be adjusted, what needs to be added. So we're kind of out of this brainstorming phase, right? We have a lot of the content, we just need to refine it. So with that said, I'm just going to pause for a second because I know that was a lot of framing and grounding, just to see if anybody has thoughts or questions before we, I'm going to do a screen share and kind of start to walk through the recommendations. But before I do that, I just want to pause for a moment and see if task force members have any thoughts or comments.
I do.
Yeah, please.
I would like to focus, if we're going to discuss equity analysis and long-term funding, the new federal funding that's coming in. Well, the importance of having equity analysis is to make sure that it doesn't go back to the status quo. A lot of that funding is going to go directly to spaces that are certain status quo spaces. And when we're talking about equity, it's establishing these recommendations now across state and federal agencies, to where now that this new federal funding is coming in, we understand that we're not just talking about a just transition, but we're showing and working with communities to look like what does a transition look like for many sectors. So just having these discussions about how federal funding can be implications to strategize good equity analysis would be really helpful now.
Yes, thanks, Renee, for adding that to the focus. And definitely, I think we can all agree that funding is definitely a conversation that we need to have, have more detail about in this section of the recommendations. And Renee, you mentioned like long-term funding. I think, we also need to think about, stuff that we need to think about immediate future and then long-term as well, right? And like what currently has funding and what resources can currently be utilized, what doesn't have funding that needs immediate funding, what can kind of wait into the future. But there's a lot of aspects of like even that when it comes to timing. Anybody else have thoughts or questions? Okay. I am going to go ahead and start with a screen share here. And can everybody see my screen okay? Thanks.
Yep, all good.
Okay. Awesome. So in looking at these recommendations, I do want to just, before we jump right into the equity recommendations, I want to refresh you all on the idea of this single coordinating entity. And this coordinating entity really to coordinate environmental justice efforts. And so we, in the report or the recommendations, the title that we give it is the Environmental Justice Coordinating Entity, which could really help build efficiencies between agencies by coordinating environmental justice efforts across the state government. As is discussed in section 1 of the recommendations, and Joel dropped a link to like the full set of recommendations in the chat. And so this is actually, I think you dropped, yeah. Okay, just for this section then. But also know that you can look at the full set of recommendations that is out for public comment currently. But right now, what we've done is we pulled out section 1 and 2. Section 2 is just focused on the equity analysis. Section 1 is just on the environmental justice coordinating entity. And it's just this one page right here that kind of outlines what they would do. And one of the potential roles that this entity would have is overseeing the creation of a centralized equity and cumulative impacts analysis. And that comes up throughout this section of the recommendations. So we just wanted to make sure that that was on your radar.
Lubna, if it's okay for me to jump in.
Getting into our order of business for today, the environmental equity and cumulative impacts analysis. So thus far, we've had a discussion about kind of 2 different approaches for an equity analysis. And I've kind of highlighted them here. And so the first approach is having individual agencies conducting a cumulative impacts analysis as part of the decision-making process for specific agency actions, similar to the approaches adopted by other states and Colorado state agencies. The other option that we've talked about, the other approach that we've talked about is this centralized environmental equity analysis that considers cross-media cumulative impacts for a specific area, which then individual agencies would later apply in specific decisions. So taking us back to the Grand Junction meeting, we did a straw poll, and essentially out of 12 people voting, 2 people voted for this kind of this first approach of project-specific equity analyses. 8 task force members voted for a centralized equity analysis, which is this kind of second approach right here. And then 2 people abstained. So it seems like the task force is generally in support of the centralized equity analysis approach. I welcome you if you strongly feel otherwise right now. And I ask that you share your opinions and thoughts on, like, you know, why you might have proposed an alternative to this. But, you know, otherwise we'd like to spend the majority of the meeting discussing how the centralized analysis or analyses should be implemented by individual agencies when making specific decisions. And we really want to provide more specificity around this centralized equity analysis. We've talked about equity analyses that will be created for individual regions across the state. So, you know, this is like this, there still would be a centralized equity analysis, but it would look different for every single region. But it would still be centralized to that region. And so the idea of like centralizing the process is that there would be this single centralized analysis per region, regardless of which agency would be conducting the analysis. So just wanted to kind of provide some background there on exactly what we're talking about here. So yeah, let's jump into section 1 on the process and mechanics of developing a centralized equity analysis, and starting off with the who should conduct the equity analysis. And we will go through this section by section. Yes, Robin.
Hi, Ledna. Hi, everybody. I just, before we dive in, I had one request, is that in the section sort of describing this, can we somehow note that, like, right in this first sentence, we have first individual agencies conducting the cumulative impact analysis similar to the approaches adopted by other states and Colorado state agencies. I wouldn't want to give the impression that that's uniform, right? There isn't like one way that other states and even across state agencies do their analyses, right? They do an individual analysis, but they don't do it all the same way. Does that make sense? And I was just hoping that maybe we could have some sort of sentence that reflects, and, you know, pulling back the curtain on, you know, I think where the air division's at is that, like, it's not standardized, right? Like, different agencies do it differently. Like, it's hard to find 2 agencies that did an individual analysis the same way, use the same definition of cumulative impacts, etc. So I would just make the request that we note that maybe the similarity is that they did an analysis as part of an individual action, not that they did the same type of analysis. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thanks, Joel, for capturing that as a comment. So I am, just so folks know how we're kind of operating this, I'm doing a screen share and Joel is doing some line editing and comments in the margins so that you all can see those live. Yes, Trisha and then Renee.
Well, I guess I would just say, you know, if we do go with a recommendation for a centralized equity analysis, I'm just not even sure that that entire paragraph would be included. For me, that was context for us right now in terms of where we are in the process and the discussion. It doesn't seem to me like language that we would include in a final report.
Right. So I think this is this is kind of getting back to my original point of like sharing some of these straw poll results with you all, is that the idea is that, right, that we're going to be focusing on a central equity analysis. And as we get here, you know, we're section 1 is really focusing on the process and mechanics of developing this centralized equity analysis. So yeah, you're absolutely right, Tricia. I mean, it is included in the report right now for task force context. And I think, Robin, you know, you add really good context here about there is like not one single way to do this first option. So, and this is where I was asking if any task force members feel really strongly about keeping this in and not going this centralized environmental equity analysis route, then we should talk about that now.
I think we do have to have a centralized analysis because we're assuming that there's already an equity analysis done. And if there was, we wouldn't have this many issues. That's like assuming everybody already does diversity and inclusion training when it's not done. So being mindful that just like we have to have a singular definition, we do have to have where state and federal agencies have the onus to prove that they're doing some form of an equity analysis and a review that it's also been done with the community.
Yeah, thanks, Renee. And I just want to reiterate that last point about doing it with community. And I saw your notes in the chat about, you know, potentially using language that specifies that we are doing this like for disproportionately impacted communities. So obviously this would benefit everybody, but I think that's an important note. Tricia.
Yeah, I wasn't able to make the August meeting, or that straw poll. So I would just note that I'm in the same camp as those who expressed a preference for this centralized equity analysis approach. I think it's just a way to do it a lot more holistically and really get a full understanding of all of the cumulative impacts, and creates, you know, opportunity for efficiencies and just like a really full, I guess, understanding of all of the impacts that different communities are experiencing, rather than, you know, focusing just within like an agency's area of expertise. So I just wanted to lodge that.
And thanks for clarifying, Robin, in the chat as well. Tyson?
I was just wondering if there's room to maybe utilize some things that have worked before, because what we're talking about are two distinct things. One is, you know, individual agencies conducting an impact analysis for whatever they may be focused on. And the second piece is making sure that those analyses get accumulated so that you can truly understand what's going on. You know, the COGC went through a lot of iterations to include information and or comment from the other agencies, such as the CDPHE and the Colorado Parks and Wildlife. If all agencies are required to comment with any impacts that may be regulated and or reviewed by their own agency, and required to provide that feedback when prompted to as part of any process, such as, and I just use oil and gas permitting because that's something that I'm extremely familiar with. When you submit an oil and gas permit, you have to send notification to CDPHE, you have to send notification to the Colorado Parks and Wildlife, you have to send notification to a lot of different agencies to make sure that they are all notified that you're going to permit an oil and gas location where it's permitted. At that point, they have a certain period of time to respond with any questions, concerns, etc. from that. If there's the ability for each agency to do an impact study and comment on that impact study, could it be an efficient way to do it if the CDPHE supplied comments around additional impacts that maybe the COGCC doesn't regulate? when they're prompted to. And if every agency did that, then you would be getting all the information from all of the agencies and be able to accumulate it on whatever process that is. I just say that because I think one of the biggest concerns is the centralized process is how does that truly work? And if you go up to section 1 and you talk about that, there's another big question that we have to answer there on how are you putting a coordinating entity and how is that going to actually work? The functionality of it is a huge question. So would it make more sense to do the individual agencies conduct it, but get input from the other agencies to complete it?
Thanks, Tyson. And I want to maybe like go back to Lubna's original question, because I think you're right. Those are huge, critical questions you all need to answer today, basically, or get as many answers as possible in order to really have some kind of productive discussions next week or 2 weeks from now in Greeley. It sounds like though, in the specific question that we're talking about right now of whether you support a cumulative or a centralized approach versus an agency by agency approach, I think I hear you say that you support the centralized approach, but we need to figure out how that will be applied by individual agencies, which is kind of one of the later items in the discussion. So am I hearing you correctly in what you're saying there?
No, I'm more saying because the individual agencies focus on certain things, they need to regulate and ensure that their impacts are recorded in a way that's effective for their agency. That's an individual approach. But if they get the additional information from the other agencies to create a cumulative impact, it would be more effective. If you just go with the centralized, I don't know how the functionality of a centralized without a lot of different compromises from a lot of different agencies is going to work.
Thanks, Tyson. So I think I still have the same question.
It's a hybrid, basically. That's what I'm saying. I'm saying is it make more sense to have some sort of hybrid?
Yeah, and I think that is what is in the document, right? So if you look at section 2B of sort of how the centralized equity analysis will be provided, it essentially reflects that hybrid model, right, of agencies taking the centralized analysis and incorporating it into their own processes in the way that makes sense for the types of decisions they make, and that reflects what is and isn't under their authority. I guess like the question I'm curious for you is, I think it sounds like you're outlining both advantages of each individual agency doing the actual analysis themselves, right? Which is the agency by agency approach, or the centralized approach in which one entity, like the contractor, does the analysis and then individual agencies apply it, which I think is what you're saying is the hybrid approach. So is that, are you leaning towards that hybrid approach, or do you think there still needs to be more discussion on the task force of each agency does their own analysis separate of all the other agencies?
Yeah, I guess I'm just still trying to see how the functionality of a centralized how that is going to be accomplished and implemented on a realistic or effective timeline. Again, that question of how do you get to a point where you have a starting point for a centralized analysis that can be used by multiple agencies. That's my concern, really, is how does that work when, if each agency already should have some sort of analysis that doesn't necessarily incorporate equity, but it can be very easily modified to do so. It would allow that to happen more quickly, and then the input from the other agencies would help build that out. So when I say hybrid, it's more of, once 50, 60 of these get done, you're going to have a centralized database going back to the coordinator who's putting this data and stuff together. So,
Oh.
so it truly is a hybrid. It really doesn't fit perfectly in those.
So Tyson, a lot of what I'm hearing you say is kind of what is outlined in how we are describing the centralized equity analysis, and maybe the terminology of like centralized is kind of like, it's not self-explanatory in itself, which is why we need like 10 pages to describe exactly like how this would be done. We are going to go through this section by section. So, you know, maybe towards the end of the conversation, if you feel like, I feel like a lot of what you are saying is addressed in these recommendations. But if at the end of the conversation, you feel like what you're saying is not being addressed, let's talk about that towards the end. We'll go Renee and then Trisha.
Yes, centralized actually helps with all of the barriers, because even between state and federal agencies, they don't communicate. You'd have to establish whole committees, whole offices, and whole directors to be able to work to collect that information. A centralized space at least provides the basic outlined infrastructure, and then you also can have community collaboration from that space as well too, between state and federal agencies. Because what we are not acknowledging is that state and federal agencies don't have this form of equity analysis where we have these contexts already involved already, and we're speaking as though they already do. Oh, they'll just adapt it eventually themselves. And we can't just leave that. We need to have some form of an accountability that they have either a deadline to adapt it and a centralized form that they can go back to across the board. So I'm kind of concerned when you break it down to where we go back to the state and federal agencies finding that onus on themselves. They won't, and they haven't. So being mindful, you'd still have to have some form of an office or a barrier or some form of bridging in between there that also takes even longer time to implement just the same.
Thanks, Renee. Trisha and then Kelly.
Yeah, and Tyson, I'm not sure if I entirely understood your hybrid approach either, but I guess I was just going to try to speak to that a little bit, because I don't think I'm on the same page with where you're going, and instead I like the way that it's laid out here. And as I picture it, and that's true. Maybe centralized isn't the right word, right? It's more like holistic equity analysis, or like a cross media cumulative. It's looking at all of the impacts to a neighborhood instead of each agency just looking at that and trying to do it for themselves. So anyway, so like a third party consultant, for example, would be like doing this assessment, would be like getting information from community, from data, from agencies about what are all of the impacts that occur in this community, putting together an analysis of that. And then each of the agencies, as this is laid out, would be tasked with having to implement that and use it in the way that's appropriate within the authorities that they have in certain actions, right? So it talks about agencies having to like implement it in that way in those specific actions. There is also a part of here, I can't remember exactly where it is in the document, but there's a recommendation that specifically speaks to when applying the equity analyses to permitting decisions for new facilities, that agencies should consider opportunities for interagency collaboration. And so there's also that piece maybe speaking to what you're talking about, which is like calling upon the agencies to, so not only is there then this like holistic equity analysis done, and then each agency is tasked with figuring out how to implement it within their specific action. But then there's this piece about when we do that, we should be mindful of what's going on, or getting input from other agencies. From our perspective, it would be helpful to understand the scope of that, right? Like you gave the example of, specifically in COGCC regulations, there's provisions about, collaborating and and consulting with CDPHE. But with this kind of an open-ended statement, it's sort of left to the agencies. Are we supposed to send it to every agency for every action, or is it discretionary, or is it each agency needs to define then who they're going to be consulting with for each of those, and how is it making sure it's meaningful? I don't, if we sent every permitting decision to every agency, we're not going to get, you know, meaningful input from others, because those are thousands of actions a year, right? So I guess stop there.
Thanks,
Well,
for sure.
and to kind of reiterate what you were saying, I think my main concern was at the beginning, where it says that there's going to be a single keep scrolling down to where the process states that you're going to select an independent third party or a university or an academic institution selected to oversee an integrity council for it's confusing to me because through the COGCC, we have a variety of approved vendors, right? That environmental, water sampling, soil sampling, air quality, air monitoring. There's a variety of third-party companies out there that work closely with the COGCC to implement their rules and regulations. And we can call those guys up and say, hey, I need a water sample here, or I need a soil sample here, or I need air monitors set up here, get that done. And you can move through the process with making sure you have all the data that you need very quickly. I have concerns of this piece here where it says you're going to have one institution like oversee all of this. And I know how many of those things and how many of those elements apply to oil and gas. And I'm like, wow, if that's just oil and gas, now you're going to add the AQCD and all of the people that they regulate in there and all of the different people that they need to worry about gathering data. And then you've got all of these other sources. How are you ever going to get to an equity analysis in a comprehensive equity analysis in a reasonable amount of time? And that's kind of the question that I'm wondering, is how the functionality of that piece to me is really, really, I just don't see how that would work. And maybe I just need to be brought up to speed on how an institution would be able to conduct that.
Thanks, Tyson. Yeah, and I think we are kind of jumping into some of the details here. So I would propose just let's go through this section by section and then kind of see if these like kind of like what you're presenting, Tyson, in terms of like the how, like how is this possible? Let's see if it's addressed in the recommendations that have been outlined. Kelly, we'll go to you, and then let's kind of go through this section by section and kind of get out of the like larger conversation, because I think when we get into the nitty gritty of these recommendations, a lot of the questions will be resolved.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to raise a terminology issue for the upfront and kind of the process and mechanics, because I went back and looked at the prior presentations from EPA and the RMG Southside Health Impact Assessment. And I mean, I think in reading this, what it seems like the task force is converging on for what's centralized is a cumulative impacts assessment. And right now, the terminology sort of switches, and sometimes is equity and cumulative impacts, and sometimes is equity analysis, and sometimes is environmental equity analysis. And the part that is being spoken of for the centralization seems like the cross-media cumulative impacts assessment for various areas. And so I was wondering if I don't know if it's premature, but like that kind of, I'm wondering if it's possible to sort of center these upfront pieces and the discussion of the centralized equity analysis on that terminology.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. And Joel, feel free to chime in if you'd like to. But we have been looking, when we talk about a centralized environmental, it is a centralized environmental equity and cumulative impacts analysis that we are talking about. All of those things in one, centralized analysis. And so thanks for flagging that maybe the language is not consistent throughout. And I think a lot of times we end up saying equity instead of saying environmental equity, but please do keep in mind that, as like the EJ, the Environmental Justice Action Task Force, and looking at the statute, we are focused on environmental equity, not, equity at large, because that could include a lot of different things. So I will just say that, and we can kind of work to like make sure that the language is consistent or more specified for certain sections. Joel?
Yeah, thanks, Philip, and I agree. And this process has moved very quickly, as you all know, and we probably have made a lot of typos and errors in the draft. So thanks for flagging that. But just to make sure you understand the substance, Kelly, and we'll work on correcting those in the next couple of drafts. But when this section covers kind of multiple concepts that the legislature told the task force to address that include both kind of the equity analysis concept and the cumulative impacts analysis and several other things as well, right, that are in the statute. But if you are kind of wondering like what is in this analysis, that that is laid out in section 3 here, which is the components of the analysis, right? So it just so everyone is on the same page, our understanding as staff is that what the task force is talking about is that an equity analysis would consist of an environmental equity and cumulative impacts analysis would consist of multiple components. Those would include a cumulative impacts analysis, a cost benefit analysis, a health impacts assessment, and potentially identifying solutions to address some of the challenges raised, right? So when we say centralized equity analysis, mean like one very long document that includes all those components that we've heard you all lay out. But so just that is the terminology that we are using to refer to one thing that has all of this built in.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the legislation alternates in some of the terminology it uses, but that subpart 3 there seems like a really important one to go through in order to determine who would be doing it and things like that.
Can you say that the legislation language goes back and forth? What legislation language are you talking about?
Well, my recollection from the EJ Act, and you all I'm sure know it better than I do, but it alternatively talks about environmental justice plan for the state and an equity analysis in certain contexts and an environmental equity analysis in others.
Okay.
As part of just the duties of what the task force is discussing.
Yeah, Kelly, I think you're looking at Colorado Revised Statute, section 25.1.133, the law that creates the task force, subpart 3 laying out the duties for the task force, and part A is talking about the sort of what the task force is making recommendations about, and subparts capital Roman numeral 1, 2, 3, and 4 all use slightly different language there, right? And we have condensed kind of all of those conversations into this equity analysis and cumulative impact subcommittee, assuming that kind of all of those different ideas that are referred to as slightly different terms could be addressed in one document. So that's how we framed kind of the subcommittee and how the subcommittee members have got into kind of laying out what components should go into this very long document that we are calling the environmental equity and cumulative impacts analysis. And to your point, Kelly, that this is a key thing to get to, I do want to go back to Lubna's point. We have laid out this meeting minute by minute, and we need to like go, right? And we promise we can get through everything, but only if you all kind of directly focus on the specific subject that we've teed up as facilitators. So I don't want to put too fine a point on it, but we are already quite behind that schedule, and we do need to really focus our conversation on the specific questions that Lubna poses to get through it all.
Thanks, Joel. Great. So I do kind of want to like skim through these first 3 sections. So again, we are in, and as was mentioned before, Joel has dropped a link to these recommendations. Again, these recommendations have been pulled out from the full report of recommendations. So we're looking at, the 9 pages here that really apply to the environmental equity and cumulative impacts analyses. We are now looking at section 1. So we'll go through this section by section. And we're talking about the process and mechanics of developing centralized equity analyses. I do kind of want to zoom through these first 3 sections because I feel like they don't need as much attention. I am also assuming that every one of you task force members have read this in excruciating detail. So if you feel that you need to talk about sections A, B, or C, please do. I'll pause for a second to see if you want to mention anything. Otherwise, we're going to move on to section D, which I think is really important for us to discuss. So section A is who should conduct the equity analysis. Section B is the purpose of the equity analyses, and then the audience for the equity analyses. So if folks have any comments on, if you want to see something different than what is on the page here, please do speak up. Otherwise, we're going to go to locations where the equity analyses should be conducted. Yes, Tyson.
And my question just alludes to that piece of how is section A work in totality? I get that everything's broken down into pieces, but section A specifically says that are you saying that you're selecting? It seems to me like we want to select one institution to oversee all when it comes to these centralized analyses. How does that work? How does that function in between all of the agencies with all of the various input and data methods and everything else that go into what everyone's collecting? If you could explain that to me, then I'd be happy. That's the only question I have.
Yeah, and I'd like to let Trisha respond to.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I mean, the way I see it is this section could potentially be connected to, depending on sort of that initial section about whether or not the task force would recommend the creation of an environmental justice coordinating entity. If that coordinating entity is created, to me, that would be a very logical place for, like, that would be the entity that could then, really facilitate bringing on an academic institution or other entity to come in and conduct that analysis and sort of do the facilitation across all of the state agencies. If that entity, if the task force doesn't think that coordinating entity should be created, or if we recommend it but the legislature doesn't agree, or just isn't the priority or whatever, and for whatever reason, if that coordinating entity does not come into being, then I have been assuming that it will likely fall to our environmental justice program to kind of be that coordinating entity and kind of facilitate this process. We certainly think that in either direction, we would be very supportive of a process for getting input into the specifics of how it's done, so that local governments and communities and stakeholders all have a voice in that.
Thank you, Trisha, and that is indeed how it's laid out in the document now. So Tyson, when we use the word like oversee in the document, to Trisha's point, that would either be the centralized, the environmental justice coordinating entity if it's created, or an interagency council likely facilitated and convened by us. The environmental justice program at CDPHE is Lobna and I and Morgan and Rosario and Natalie and everyone you've worked with all along, right? But we would not be doing the analysis, right? We would be, or the coordinating entity, we would be selecting a vendor, like a consultant, who would then do the actual work, right? So that's how it's laid out now. So it sounded like you were raising a concern with, like, is there any vendor that can do that has that broad of a range of expertise? So is that where concern lies? And if so, do you have like an alternative to propose, or what would you suggest?
I just think when I look at it in practicality and actuality, because I work between two major agencies currently. I work between the COGCC and the BLM. So coordinating vendors for instance, a NEPA analysis. Okay, there are certain vendors that the BLM prefers to work with in most areas. However, there are very specific vendors for specific areas that the CDP, not even really the COGCC, but the CPW wants to work with, who is a consultant in the COGCC permitting process. So we try to ensure that we coordinate a vendor that the CPW does like to work with, along with the BLM, and make sure that the BLM understands that, hey, we would prefer to use this vendor because it is also a vendor that is associated with the CPW. And it sounds very simple, but the coordinating of those is not as simple as that sounds. So I just, again, if you're then going to take that and then take that and shovel that over to another entity to take a look at it and say, yeah, we're good with those vendors, or no, we're not good with those vendors. And then it's got to go back through that circle to find the right vendor. And that's one piece of an analysis that takes probably, I would say, an upwards of a dozen to 15 different vendors to complete the task at hand for one type of analysis, right? So that's where I see, that's where I have a lot of questions in my mind about how all of this is going to be coordinated by one oversight office or committee or oversight entity. And that's one example of the 8th to smallest operator in the state of Colorado of one industry. So again, when I look at this, that type of oversight and understanding on an individual, on one entity overseeing all of that, rather than, again, our recommendations, I think can, like Renee had concerns about, well, every entity hasn't done that yet, but it also hasn't been required by statute and or recommendations for every entity to go through that type of rigorous rulemaking that the COGCC already had to do, and make sure that they have those in place so that they do it the right way. I just don't see how you're going to get one entity to coordinate all of it over the whole state of Colorado for all different industries that have all different impacts. That to me seems like you're going to have to create the most massive office in the state of Colorado, and I don't know if that's the right way to do it.
Yeah, thanks, Tyson. And I think, I think all the questions that you're raising are valid. I will just say that I think, in being solutions oriented and trying to figure out how we can get to a, equity analysis model that can be used, statewide and focus on cumulative impacts, which is very clearly a priority of this task force and is laid out in the statute as a task that's put forth for you all task force members to resolve. I think we need to kind of figure out solutions to those issues that you're raising, right? And I don't think we can stop at not proposing something because we find it to be challenging or even impossible. I think a lot of what we have outlined here provides specificity on even who should conduct the analysis, I think can be better answered by providing specificity on, really what the entire analysis entails. And so I do want to move us forward in the conversation to kind of get to some of these more specific questions, because it's kind of like working backwards. Like we might be able to answer some of those questions in a more solutions oriented format if we can get to kind of the meat of the discussion here. I'm going to go Renee, and then again, just kind of move us on to section D.
Thank you, Lebna. Honestly, you said it. They're not going to do things if they don't have to across state and federal agencies. And yes, this is equity that is long overdue. And I'm sure it's complex. I'm sure it's daunting, but it's long overdue to literally acquire for some of our communities to never have it. So that's why we're here to some degree, is to make it uncomfortable for state and federal agencies to do equity analysis in a way they never have, because it's been uncomfortable for our communities this long. So being really mindful of that when we're talking about trauma and cultural sensitivity, especially with community, because they're living that issue now. And being mindful that this was also supposed to be a complete access to public record throughout. So to know who those vendors are and it be public, it helped it being an academic institution because it was able to be based on factual analytical data that's already an intersection with community to work as one of those vendors, potentially overseen by several different agencies so that they can be involved in that space as well too. Because I remember when we were proposing certain things for the bill, it needed to be public access throughout the entire space so that it could also be transparent for community about where are they getting their analytics for equity analysis for their data to begin with before they even conduct that to bring to state and federal agencies as well. So being mindful about private vendors and how they also work with and around community.
Yeah, and Renee, honestly, I don't disagree with any of that. I think what I'm trying to get at here is I want to make sure that this does happen and that we do get to a point that it can be implemented. What I'm saying is, I just know from, and Joel can attest to how long it took for all the COGCC rules and regulations to change. We can make those requirements. We can require that they undergo rulemakings and that they undergo things to incorporate these and make sure that we give them the guidelines to incorporate it. But again, to make sure that it actually happens and to make sure that it doesn't get, stalled in the bureaucracy of creating, this centralized thing. I think it's actually more implementable if it goes through those agencies. They make requirements to get those things done. And then you have a coordinator that can help connect the dots between the agencies to ensure that no piece is left out. That's kind of where I was going. And I'm not trying to change the scope or the way or the reason that we do it. I just, when I look at the actual process, knowing somebody who's been on it, like knowing that I've gone through the process on, a single project that is so insignificant compared to all the other projects that go on in the state of Colorado, the amount of work that is necessary to be accurate and to be conscious of what's actually going on in those areas is huge. And if you try to make all those projects go to one entity, it's either going to result in nothing being done, or it's going to result in people just pushing things off and saying, yeah, whatever. And then you get stuck in the same wheel we've always been in. So I'm really looking at it from a can we be specific and can we ensure things get done?
Tyson, just so
that's why funding is key too, though. So being mindful, that's why I mentioned that earlier about how to strategize the long-term goal as well, because funding can help in that space as well, but not proposing it just because it's uncomfortable to change that status quo is why we're here, is because I see where you're coming from, but that discomfort has to happen because our communities are living that already. So it is state and federal agencies realizing, oh, that's never worked. And it's going to have to change even in how we propose our funding to maintain that space so that if it's that complex of an issue, it's addressed adequately for equity.
And I would just say, Tyson, I don't see this at all as a recommendation that all projects go to just one entity. Like, to me, it's not at all a proposal that, that all, like if a project has in the past needed an air permit and a water permit and an oil and gas permit, that now that would all be from one entity by any stretch. Rather, those entities would still have their permitting responsibilities and processes. It's just that now they would have this additional tool in this centralized equity analysis to be able to look through the lens as they're taking that action. It's just another resource for us to be able to understand what the challenges are in that community and how that our action could either could either play into that, or how the current state of things, should affect how we look at the new the permitting action. I see it that way, not as like all actions are suddenly going to like a newly created entity.
Thanks, Tricia. So I'm going to go ahead and move us on to section D here. And again, we continue to welcome like public comment as well as task force member written comment on these sections that we're not going through in detail. But we'll go ahead and move on here. And Joel, feel free to share before we do.
Yeah, sorry. So I know we do need to move on and we're behind. So Tyson, I mean, you'll probably see little snippets of what you were saying throughout the document and in comments, right? Like, I think what you were saying gets at multiple different things throughout the recommendations. I guess I'm just not sure what solution you're proposing to the challenge of like vendor selection that you mentioned. And I'll just say, as your staff, we've gotten pretty good at turning like questions and concerns into new regulatory text. But I guess I can envision two solutions to what you're saying. One is that the process should select multiple vendors to conduct a single study, given sort of the complexity and wide range of subject matter. The other would be, which would be something we should put here in section A about who conducts the analysis. The other alternative would be putting something in section 1F, timeline and updates, to reflect that the timeline needs to understand that the process of selecting a vendor in a complex interagency process takes a really long time, especially when you need kind of a unicorn vendor who can do it all. So I'm curious what you would prefer as a solution to that challenge you raised. Is it, the interagency council should kind of select one entity to look at air quality, and like a university to look at air quality, and a consultant to look at water quality, and a third university to look at soil? Or is it, let's just make sure our timeline knows it's going to take like 12 months to pick a vendor?
I mean, that's we're talking about regulations that have an effect on such a wide range of things. To sit there and say that that's kind of why I have the concern over how this works. I like Tricia's explanation of having somebody that actually is just another source of information, but that's not what I'm hearing from you. What I'm hearing from you is they're the controlling entity over how this is happening. And that's, because if they're setting the timelines, they're setting the vendors, they're doing all that, they're in control of the process. So who's in control of the process is kind of how it is, and who's accountable for that process. Because if something happens where, for instance, an oil and gas location gets approved after going through this process, is the lawsuit against the equity team for allowing that process to go through, or is it something that they need to go talk to the COGCC about? And that's where the conversion of this, I'm still confused on how that works. So I'll just stop. I want to listen to the rest of it. I've read through it, but nothing is very clearly stated. It kind of hops back and forth between who's in charge of what, and if it's a resource, or if it's and the office's responsibility. There are a lot of questions that I have, but I'll wait till we get through all that and then re-comment again.
Yeah, thanks, Tyson. And I think, that a lot of that will be addressed throughout this. And we can definitely try to tweak the language to make kind of what you were just saying more clear, that, that we are not getting at that the consultant would be like the expert entity in implementation. It would be that they are a resource for essentially making this happen. So I'm going to move us on to section D, locations where the equity analysis should be conducted. I'm going to give us about 5 to 10 minutes to talk about this section, because there's a lot more that we need to get through. So I'd like to spend maybe like 5 or 10 minutes here, and then go on to section F, which is about the timeline and updates, which I think needs a lot more detail that we were just touching on. So I just want to highlight this kind of portion of this section here. The task force recommends that the geographic scope of an individual centralized equity analysis should be a regional grouping of surrounding disproportionately impacted communities. The analysis should focus on census block groups that meet the definition of disproportionately impacted community within an area. So just kind of taking us back again to the August 25th meeting, we had a conversation, and the majority of the task force members voted in favor of this geographic scale in the straw poll, but there was not exactly 2/3 support around this concept. And so I just wanted to open this up for discussion to see if there's anybody that feels differently about kind of how the scale should be applied.
I'll jump in, Lubna. I think one comment I'd make is just, I wonder about allowing for some more flexibility than that. Just, given the nature, just every community is different, and there absolutely will be some times when that's the appropriate scale, but I don't want to assume that that's going to be the case for all communities. So I would encourage us to include some flexibility for discretion and judgment.
Thanks, Tricia. And we can build that type of language directly into the recommendations and to our task force members. And I know that we're shifting gears here. We would love to hear from all the task force members on this if you have thoughts, but building in language that reflects flexibility and discretion is exactly what we can do to make these recommendations be a little bit more holistic and realistic. So please do keep the ideas coming. Any other thoughts on this, on the geographic scope of a centralized equity analysis? And again, we're talking about a centralized equity analysis that would be centralized for different regions across the state, right? Not one blanket centralized equity analysis. It would be, because every community is different, we've established this several times, that it would be a centralized equity analysis focusing on a certain area. So in this case, census block groups is what we've decided. But would love to hear, and Tricia noted that we'll kind of build in flexibility because even that might not be a hard and fast rule. Renee.
Oh, sorry, couldn't get to my mute button. Honestly, I want to back up Tricia on that one and piggyback. Census block already doesn't cover Indigenous communities appropriately. How can we involve some form of data analytics that could also help with data gaps to include in this space as well when we're trying to take in equity analysis to learn where there's been data gaps before to create DIC. So yes, flexibility, and how can we be more mindful about how do we include certain analytics that already are not considered in the same spaces we keep drawing data from.
Thanks, Renee. So noted.
Hope that made sense, sorry.
Yeah, that made sense. Thanks. Any other thoughts on this, on the location and how we are kind of using scale? Okay, I'm going to move us on to the next section. I know that we're going to be going through this fast, but we have an agenda, and I just want to make sure that we get through all the items. And I think adding in flexibility language here will help. I'm going to just, if anybody has thoughts or comments on community engagement, feel free to drop them in the chat. Otherwise, I'm just going to kind of just quickly go through that section and move on to timeline and updates. So we really want to hear if there's anything more from the task force that you would like to elaborate on or express, more specificity on the timeline in this section. How else can you express the timeline is urgent while also ensuring that what you propose is feasible and implementable? And really, how often do you think that these updates should occur? So right now, you know, the section is short, it's 2 sentences, it's concise. So, you know, would love to open it up for conversation here. So how else would you like to express the timeline? Again, you know, I think the issue here is like many task force members are like, this is urgent, this equity analysis needs to happen now, but then how can we build in enough detail to ensure that this is actually implementable and is actually feasible? And we're focusing on being solutions oriented here. So I don't want you to take my question and explain how complex it is. I would love for you all to kind of share the solution, and you know, if there's any thoughts on how the timeline could be specified to get to that.
I would just reflect that in, you know, in that first paragraph, in addition to recognizing absolutely the urgency, and then the other component of like, not just the time needed to do the analysis, but also to do all that process leading up to it of like understanding how it's going to be done, right? Which relates to some of the other conversation and discussion, which, you know, I want to just make sure that we, you know, really leave space for our community input, local government input, stakeholder input into that.
Thanks, Tricia. Others want to elaborate on expressing more specificity on the timeline in this section? I also just want to keep in mind that we will have a few minutes for public comment at the very end, but if there are members of the public that are on that have ideas, you know, these meetings are public meetings, so please feel free to drop your ideas in the chat. We will be looking at those as well.
I have a, sorry, I didn't raise my hand, Lubna, is it okay?
Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe our recommendation could be something, and this is just brainstorming for the task force, could be, because this is a recommendation to the legislature to create this coordinating entity and fund it, that in the, you know, in the enabling legislation, that the legislature should address timelines, or like consider addressing timelines, and like, you know, or, you know, indicating like the urgency and the need for this, but not setting one, because there's, again, like there, you know, there's going to want to be, communities are, I would imagine, are going to want to engage in the process of what the equity analysis, centralized analysis looks like. And, you know, things like that. And people are, so anyway, since what we're doing is not deciding the timeline, we're recommending to the legislature that they create this entity and fund it, give it duties and authority to do this work, like that they, you know, we recommend to the legislature that they consider, you know, addressing need to not have this drag out in some way. But I don't see how it's possible for us to like have a timeline in here, given all of the work that has to go into it. So, and we don't like know what the funding is going to be, right? How much money is authorized by the legislature for this will inform how quickly different analyses can get done. And I think it would be helpful, and I don't know at what point, I don't know if comments like this have come in on the draft recommendations, but if communities have offered thoughts on like at what level they would like to have input into the centralized equity analyses, like do communities want input on all the decisions that have to be made, right? Like on the scope of the geographic location and, you know, all of the things that are going to be considered in the centralized equity analysis, and, you know, who does it, like the you know, how much do we want to recommend that communities be engaged in all of the decisions, because the balance of that is that it's going to take more time, right? So I don't know if we've solicited feedback I don't feel comfortable opining on that, right? But maybe some of our representatives on the task force could speak to how much engagement they would want communities to have. So I'll stop.
Yeah. Thanks, Robin. Yeah, and I think those are all really great points. And also just, you know, something for the task force to think about is that, like, while you all may not have all the solutions, like proposing something like the legislature should be the ones to consider addressing the timeline issue is a perfectly fine recommendation. These are recommendations at the end of the day. And so if that, you know, seems like kind of the most feasible next step, that is 100% A-okay. Renee.
I would say all the community legitimately for equity needs that form of transparency throughout the entire process. But having some type of accountability review throughout the time so that community can also have feedback consistently throughout the timelines to say, this isn't meeting our needs. We're seeing the recommendations. This isn't okay. This doesn't speak for our equity. Someone else in the chat, Colin, also put, consider timelines that flex with regulatory schedules so opportunities are not missed to use analysis. So being mindful where community members are already involved often in testimony or testifying where they want to be in that space already, and involving those community members again with funding in other spaces where they can continually do that form of community monitoring and accountability to be involved throughout the process.
Yeah, thanks, Renee, and thanks, Colin, for your comment in the chat. And we are taking notes and pulling public comments from the Zoom chat into our notes document. And as usual, for folks that are new to this meeting, Joel is taking kind of margin comments, high-level margin comments, and then Morgan is taking much more detailed notes in our notes document, which can also be found in the public drive. Okay. Any other thoughts here on timelines and updates before we move on? And while we're on this topic of, we had kind of lightly touched on community and curious about like what the public has to say, I did just want to provide a quick update to the task force members on public comment. So far we've received 35 survey responses, at least 12 written public comments. We've done a coffee chat in Pueblo last week, and we'll be doing another coffee chat, especially with monolingual Spanish speakers tomorrow in Commerce City, North Denver. And so these are all kind of ways that we've been trying to get feedback from the public on the recommendations. I will say that, you know, 35 surveys filled out is a much lower number than our initial survey. In the initial draft that we created a survey for, we had over 200 respondents to that survey. Public comment is open until Friday. I did send out a communications toolkit to all the task force members to utilize and share to encourage your networks to provide public comment on this draft. Please keep in mind, this is one of the last opportunities that folks will have to provide public comment outside of the meetings themselves, when we'll have kind of like a verbal public comment. But in terms of like substantive written public comment on all of the recommendations, folks have until Friday. And so I just really, again, final plug to our task force members to please kind of encourage your networks and your communities to provide their input. And us staff are actually doing a lot. We've actually done more than we have in the last set of recommendations to get that public input. We've done 4 listserv posts. We've put stuff on our website. We've done a press release. So we are working hard to, you know, get the word out that, you know, public comment is open until Friday, but would love for you all to help us out with that as well. So any other comments on timeline before we move on to section 2? Okay. Yeah, and thanks, Joel, for putting those links in the chat to the survey and those other resources that we've provided. All right, so moving on to section 2. And I promise I will provide you all with a break in about half an hour. So I know this is a long meeting and complex topic, so let's just chug on for another half hour, and then we'll have about a 10-minute break. So use and application of completed centralized equity analyses. Starting off with who should use the equity analyses. And I'd like to spend, a significant amount of time here talking about this. At the August 25th meeting, we again conducted a straw poll about which agencies should apply the centralized equity analysis. And just to kind of go over what those options were for the straw poll and share back results. There were 12 voting members at the meeting that day. 4 people voted for option 1, which is that all state agencies that take actions that can impact the environment. And sorry, I'll do some better framing of this question. So you all were asked, who should apply the centralized equity analysis? So 4 people said all state agencies that take action that can impact the environment. 6 people said option 2, that who should be applying the centralized equity analysis should be a specific list of state agencies that the task force will identify in the future. We're in the future, so let's talk about that. And then option 2 was, option 3, which had 2 votes, was this idea of having a pilot program of 1 or 2 state agencies to ensure that the equity analyses can be successfully implemented in 1 to 4 specific decision-making processes or proceedings. So this had like the least amount of popularity amongst the task force members. So 6 people voted for this, option 2, that we would come up with a specific list of state agencies at a later date. This is the later date. So let's elaborate on this and talk about which agencies the centralized equity analysis should be applied to or used by. And this is where we would really love to hear from, especially the state agency representatives on this task force, because we're talking about the agencies, we're talking about you all. And while we would love to hear from everyone, we would really like to hear from our agency reps. One last thing before I'll stop talking and kind of open it up for discussion is I just want to reiterate that we are creating a very safe space here, where we can have really open and honest conversations on what is realistic and what is actually feasible for agencies. And just please keep in mind that we've heard from several agency reps that like funding and resources could be a really major barrier to achieving an equity analysis, which is why we've added this kind of most recent sentence here, which is if the legislature adopts the recommendation for agencies to develop and implement the equity analysis, it should ensure that each individual agency that is required to or has discretion to use the equity analysis in its decision-making receives adequate funding to participate in developing the equity analysis and to implement the analysis in its decisions. So we've kind of added this caveat after like hearing several agency folks be like, we would love to do this, but funding is the issue. So hopefully this kind of reflects that, but you can see that we've kind of outlined some agencies here, but do other folks want to elaborate on this and maybe build out the list of state agencies? And if this is what we want to keep it to, that's fine too.
Well, sorry to always be the first to be jumping in, but I guess where my thought is because there is the potential for how this is applied and who it applies to is absolutely interrelated with the resource issue that you noted, Lubna. It's like, to me, I guess that means that's why it would be really helpful and important for either the task force or the legislature. Somebody needs to say which agencies need to apply or implement the equity analysis and in what actions, because then those agencies are better able to assess what the potential resource impact and resource need is to make sure that we're doing it right and can affect change. So that's one piece. And then I wonder, because of that too, I wonder if this is an area where we might want to think about best, this is our best, but or this is our favored recommendation is, this slate of agencies or this slate of actions that it would apply to. But if that results in too much funding that the legislature, isn't supportive of, then we would be, supportive of a tier that's sort of scaled back from that, whether that's doing a pilot or something else. I'm just wondering if we want to think about this more on a gradated scale instead of just like black and white options. Like, for example, if I had been at this poll, I would have maybe asked, can I vote for two things, right? Because I might want to vote for like option 2 as my first choice, but option 3 is something I could live with.
Yeah, thanks, Trisha. And Rob, Renee, go ahead. And then Robin, I would love if you could kind of elaborate on what you wrote in the chat as well.
I'm a DIC representative, so in all honesty, we're going to have sweeping decisions made about our communities under all of them. So equity analysis is all state and federal agencies that make decisions, especially in these communities and their sources of life, their resources, how it's going to apply to disproportionately impacted communities already. So to me, it has to be all, and it has to be a form of analysis through all, because that's already where the gap is. And then recognizing that DIC, you're making these decisions already with communities not involvement. So being mindful that the least you can do is bring us equity.
Yeah, thanks. We'll go Robin and then Dominique.
Yeah, so as I think I sometimes sound like a broken record on, what I'm trying to focus on is like making sure we achieve the ends of environmental justice and equity. And in order to do that, agencies need clear direction, right? Because if they don't know what to do, then they're not going to do the thing that we want them to do, right? So that's sort of my worldview, if you will. And so in service of that, like when we're talking about identifying agencies and using these equity analyses, right? We've talked about having agencies use them in decision making. But, like CDPHE is a really sprawling agency, and Trisha obviously will know how many divisions, CDPHE has and how many different programs, but I guess it made some innate sense to me to not use the nomenclature of CDPHE when we're talking about what agencies. And this, to be clear, I think like every conversation I've ever had is like CDPHE generally like welcomes, right, and wants to foster and be a laboratory and like be a leader on environmental justice. When we're talking about specifically the piece of this of implementing a centralized equity analysis and agency decision making, I think we should be clear when we're describing what agencies are directed to do, which agencies are supposed to do the thing. And not all CDPHE agencies do permitting, for example, or like their types of permitting is really different, like, licensing of versus environmental permitting or things like that. So I'm just trying to advocate that we be specific around the actual agency doing the permitting work if we're talking about permitting, or like, so that would be Air Pollution Control Division, Water Quality Control Division, right? Or if we're talking rulemaking, right, that's Air Quality Control Commission or Water Quality Control Commission, and not use nomenclature like generally just CDPHE, I think was my suggestion.
Dominique?
Sure. So building and kind of responding to Renee and building off what she said, and then also on what Robin just said, I think that we do need to bring in some agencies and bring in some activities that maybe don't always come to mind. So of course, some of the work that CDPHE does around permitting is obvious, but I would also say some of the funding decisions that are made by agencies like the Department of Local Affairs, which doesn't have a seat on this task force, would also come to mind because they make a lot of funding decisions around affordable housing and other choices like that. I represent a non-regulatory, non-enforcement agency, but we do also make funding choices where we give out grants, et cetera. So if we are going to do option 2, I would start with a fairly expansive view. And then, like Tricia said, perhaps try to prioritize somewhat within that if there is not sort of funding availability to make that a reality within that more expansive view that goes beyond sort of regulatory and permitting into grant making and investment decisions as well. But I'm also wondering, should we like make a list? I mean, Lubna, you're like the future is today. It does seem like we probably need to come up with a short list so that the task force can actually, if number 2 is the favored option, we need to know who are we talking about here. Do you want us to start naming agencies, I guess is my question, or is this something we're putting off?
Well, yeah, it's it's not something that we're putting off, right? This is
I'm in agreement with what Dominic is suggesting. We should list off the agencies.
Okay. Yeah, and we are not putting this off, right? We're trying to get into a position for the October meeting that you all are, ideally by the October meeting, these options don't exist. We have a list of state agencies, and then, whatever caveats we need to put in here, such as this one, about, hey, okay, a lot of this is really going to depend on funding. We're not going to just list agencies and expect them to just magically make this happen without any funding available. So whatever we need to elaborate on for option 2 to make it actually feasible, that is fine. But I think one thing that the task force has generally had some consensus around is that there should be some sort of list of state agencies that we can kind of base this entire section off of. Sheila.
I am in favor of combining options 1 and 3. I voted for option 1, and I see the utility in option 3. I think something needs to be piloted to figure out how this can be successfully implemented. And once we have an understanding of that, moving to option 1. And so I'm just wondering, it seems like all of these options are mutually exclusive is my concern. And I think that there needs to be sort of this runway where we figure out how to implement it for either option 1 or option 2, but I am a strong supporter of option 1. So I'm wondering, if you vote for option 3, then what does that say about after we have that understanding of what implementation looks like?
Sheila, I'll maybe jump in there. And I think to your point, we as your staff have tried to frame things more sort of linearly or kind of in clearly separated options, and they necessarily have to be. And that's to kind of facilitate things like straw polls to gauge where people are. But I think you're right that these options are not mutually exclusive. And I think that's really what Dominique was getting at, as well as Tricia. And so I think as your staff, we can probably turn this discussion into a amalgamated combination of all 3 options that kind of reflects to Dominique's point, that there should be prioritization amongst agencies that conduct certain types of tasks, which is really the option 2, that could begin with a pilot program and eventually get to all agencies that take those types of actions that impact the environment, while recognizing in your sort of direct communication to the legislature this report that, as important as it is for you to get to all, you recognize that there need to be priorities in terms of where to start with that pilot program, for example, or if the legislature says there's not enough funding for every agency that does permitting. So I think we as staff can probably combine them if you all kind of are leaning towards that combination, and then have that ready for you to review in October.
Renee?
And the recommendation to funding is going to be incredibly key here, because most agencies have to, or all agencies have to apply by the ADA, the Americans Disability Act. And if you're going to impact the environment at this point, it should be mandatory by that point, because and for disproportionately impacted communities, or we're not going to address the validity of even the task force and our recommendations. So being mindful that that's also where we have to say, this is where funding has to go, and certain things for forms of equity where there is none, and the impact on those communities and the environment's known cumulative impacts has to be addressed with some type of accountability. So being mindful that we need to cast that wider net for equity first, and then of course prioritize those that are already making rulemaking and policy making now.
Thanks, Renee. Michael?
Yeah, I think I like the prioritization, and then also like how that can help lead to at least getting on paper where we would like to see potential funding going. But I think that to Sheila's point, it leads into the option 3 option of, so let's say top 3 departments or issues are whatever we decide, then that could help influence a future pilot to see if those agencies and departments can actually implement some of the recommendations. Is that, you guys tracking that? I don't see no heads nodding from you or Joel.
It's because we're note taking very.
Because I'm eating apples today, Joel. No, I'm right here.
Yeah, no, we got it, Michael. Sorry, my head's exploding a little bit with
Yep.
the number of different places to pull notes from, but I'm adding your comment in response to Sheila.
Y'all carry on. Thank you.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is that we do want to kind of maybe think about writing up an amalgamation of these things, and let's maybe eliminate some of these options and think about how we can combine some of these ideas, which all have received some votes. So I'm hearing kind of folks across the board saying like they like bits and pieces of different aspects of these options. So we as your staff can certainly work on kind of incorporating what we're hearing into kind of a new paragraph on what would be like a feasible solution on who would be conducting or who would be using this equity analysis. I am curious. I am curious if we want to kind of add a little bit more specificity around this section, maybe not so much in terms of like naming agencies, but the types of like priorities. I mean, we've heard from folks about like rulemaking and permitting and enforcement and funding grants. But I just wanted to see if anybody wanted to elaborate on that point, whether we should list agencies or perhaps list the types of actions to provide more specificity for the section. Yeah, Trisha.
Off the cuff, I would say what floats to the top for me would be to prioritize decisions around permitting of new facilities or sources. I don't know the exact right word there. Grant opportunities and some rulemaking hearings, but I like the ones that really would have an impact. And I don't, I don't know how to define that or put that into words, but just sort of in terms of like, what are the decisions that agencies make that most impact people's lives? Like those are the ones that come to the top for me, but I'll think on it some more.
Thanks, Michael.
Just with my community hat on, I think it should be agencies listed, just because of, not every resident understands who has authority to do rulemakings or permits, and so I think you list the agency and then you have like a subset that kind of gives a brief description of their authority. But I'm open to hearing from others who are with some of the state agencies and departments.
Any others on thoughts about listing state agencies? And if so, do folks want to create a list that we can maybe put on paper today? And again, we're trying to get us to a place that for the October meeting, and just to be really clear, the October meeting is going to be a 2-day meeting. A lot of time on October 24th will be focused on this equity analysis. So we're trying to get to like a little bit more of a refined place where we can have a conversation with the entire group. We recognize that not everybody is here today, but as much as we can major shifts to these sections and as much specificity that we can provide and bring this to the October meeting for further discussion would be ideal. So if others, thanks Trisha, we heard from you on exactly like what types of priority actions, and then Michael, I heard from you about, yeah, it would be good to like list some state agencies. So do folks want to start creating that list today? And we can just jot some down in the notes and make sure to incorporate those and then revisit them at the October meeting. Otherwise, we can just table this conversation until then.
Well, I think one element of this that I think we need to keep in mind as well is that all the various state agencies are at extremely different levels of this. Some of them have zero, regulations written around these types of analyses. Others have, quite significant amounts that have been added of recent that probably need to be expanded on. But I'll bring up the COGCC again because that's the one that I know the best. And in our presentation that was given by the COGCC staff, they have had zero facilities in or around DI communities, or in DI communities as defined currently. Now that definition may change that, but there's also, the fact that those rules just came into implementation earlier this year. So how do we prioritize them without knowing? And I only know that where the COGCC is at, but I know the COGCC is a heck of a lot farther than a lot of other agencies. So how do we prioritize them if we don't have a list of what it is? That's why I think we go with something like number one, that all state agencies that have environmental impacts need to implement this, and they need to go through whatever needs to be done to do that. And for the COGCC instance, they're going to have to make some changes, but not as marketed changes as some other agencies are going to have to.
Yeah, thanks, Tyson. And I just want to reiterate that we definitely have recognized that, right? That, different agencies have different types of action that they take. And Joel just dropped the link to that we administered to actual agencies to provide us feedback on the different types of actions that their agency takes. And so, that table really outlines, it's not the prettiest table, but it is it has all of the information in there. So we definitely recognize, right, that every agency is different. Every action that an agency takes is different and the authorities are different. So that's definitely something that we've had in the back of our minds.
No, I definitely get that. I was just trying to, I guess, bring it to the front of the minds if we're making lists.
Okay, well, thanks all. I think with that said, it sounds like a list of state agencies could be helpful, but considering we are combining a lot of these options, which does include that all state agencies that take action that can impact the environment are who should use the equity analysis. We'll kind of stop there. And then in October, when we meet, if there is a push from any task force members where we feel like, okay, in addition to this, it would be good to list these state agencies. We would love those suggestions. And Dominique, before, yeah.
Yeah, I just think even in preparation of that, if we added a table that sort of said that had, that would allow us to move from one to either two or three, that had a list of like agencies with regulatory actions on the environment, CDPHE, et cetera, agencies with grant making actions, and listed them. So we could at least get a sense of the universe that we're talking about. That would probably be helpful. And I think that we can take what Joel shared. Right away, it jumps out to me that like DOLA and CDOT are not on that list, both of which I would include in some of these, but I would think that would help frame the conversation in October, since there's not sort of shared knowledge among the task force in terms of like who we're talking about and what they do.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, Dominique, that's so helpful. I think like those really concrete, like what do you need to see to make the decision is hugely helpful for us as staff. So thank you. And you're right. So not all state agencies filled out the survey that we administered, right? Which is why our current list isn't complete. So that's a great flag. And I wonder, I don't want to put you on the spot, but if I sort of create a draft sometime next week, would you maybe be willing to spot check it and just see if it's kind of on point for what you're envisioning?
Totally. And yeah, I think that would help. So thank you all. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thanks, Kelly and Dominique. I think, this is really getting at the audience again, right? That we never want to lose sight of the audience of like the people reading these recommendations are the legislature and the governor and CDPHE. And so as much detail as we can provide to give them direction, I think that will ensure that these recommendations are successful. Okay. So with that said, I think I'm feeling kind of a natural break in the conversation, and would love to give folks a little bit of a breather. Let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break. Let's return at 4:05, and we're going to continue on to sections B and C. Yeah, enjoy your 10-minute break. Please do step away from your computer. Don't go back to checking your email, because otherwise you're not going to get the blood flow that you need to keep your brain nice and engaged as it has been. So yeah, let's take a quick break. We'll be back in at 4:05. Right, welcome back, everyone. And if task force members could just give me like an emoji of a thumbs up or turn your camera on for a second, just so I know that you're back at your desk. Okay, I think I saw that about 3 task force members are back. So Michael, Renee, Jamie, Kelly, if you are all back, if you could just indicate so. All right. To not further delay, let's go ahead and move on. And I would like to get us started with section B. I am still screen sharing, right? Okay. Okay, so I wasn't planning on spending too much time on sections B, C, and D. And I really just wanted to get kind of a quick sense of if folks are in support of these recommendations. And if so, we'd kind of like to move on to the next section. So here we're talking about how the centralized equity analyses should be applied. And then the role of local governments and community engagement. So I just will pause for a moment to see if there's any input that anyone would like to provide on any of these sections, and raise any concerns if there are any, especially related to what it means or a desire for more information, and if there's any information that we can provide as staff by the October meeting to help address any concerns that you might have with these sections. Again, if it's helpful, you all can kind of scroll through this and read this and look at the version that Joel dropped in the chat, which would just allow you to kind of go through the document yourself, as opposed to just looking at the screen share. But we are talking about sections B, C, and D on how the centralized equity analyses should be applied, local governments, and community engagement. Kelly, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I like the direction this is going in. I've been wondering if in implementing flexibility, agencies should be using a similar standard as what's proposed under community engagement in terms of decisions that impact, what is the language? Decisions that could significantly impact the environment or public health in a disproportionately impacted community. So that was the standard that was being suggested in section 5 on the broader recommendations for when best practices for community engagement should be used. And I was wondering if that same sort of standard should be used here, as that's the focus area for when the centralized equity analysis would be applied. Like in paragraph 2 under B, I don't know that specific types of PUC proceedings have to be called out for this, because we're going to have to go through that and figure out kind of proceeding by proceeding what threshold is going to meet that. So does that make sense?
Kelly, it does make sense. And if you give me just a second, I'll copy paste that language from section 5, the best practices for community engagement, of the overall recommendations here, so that everyone can sort of see it in one place. So I'm just going to put it between the first 2 paragraphs in section B. There is that language that I've pasted in. Actually, sorry, don't look at it. I'm actually going to make it in suggestion mode, so it's clear that it's new language we're adding. Okay, there we go.
Thanks, Kelly. Any others have, and yes, noted that, just to be clear, Kelly, that some of these examples should be removed, that this level of specificity is not really necessary. Any others have thoughts on these sections, B, C, and D of section 2, how the centralized equity analyses should be applied, local governments, and community engagement? Okay, thanks all. I'm sorry for the very long silences, but sometimes I know that it takes time for folks to just kind of like re-skim through something and gather their thoughts. So if you need more time, please do flag that. Otherwise, we're going to move on to section 3. Okay, so section 3, components of the equity analysis. In this section, we are just talking about the components that should be in an equity analysis, not standalone analyses conducted by agencies for specific decisions. So keep in mind, based on the geographic area that we discussed earlier, this will only be, there will only be a few of these equity analyses for individual areas. This is not saying that each agency needs to do a cumulative impacts analysis or a health impacts assessment for individual decisions. Rather, the centralized equity analysis will include these components for agencies to tier to in their decisions should they decide to do that analysis. So I hope that kind of provides a little bit of clarity about the components that we're talking about here. And we have a series of questions that we kind of opened up to members of the public. A lot of these questions have come out of several of our other meetings, as well as our August meeting. I'm just going to read them aloud here and then would love to kind of open it up to see if task force members have solution-oriented responses to any of these questions that would kind of get us closer to having, you know, a more finite components section or intro section of the analysis. So the first question here is, how do the components of the equity analyses fit within the way that an agency would ultimately apply each analysis? How should an agency that does not have regulatory authority to address some components of analysis incorporate the analysis into its decisions? For a centralized equity analysis, the geographic scope of the impacts of an agency decision may be different. It might be larger or smaller than the scope of the centralized equity analysis conducted for a specific area. So how should agencies account for this? How do the components of equity analyses interact with other equity assessment tools like Colorado EnviroScreen? And lastly, do some components of the equity analysis make sense only for a centralized analysis or an action-specific analysis? So again, these are some questions that have kind of bubbled up and we don't have really concrete solutions to. So I welcome folks to kind of reread through these and share any thoughts they might have.
So this is Dominique. Hi, I can speak to a little bit of the number 2. So representing an agency that does not have regulatory authority, period. There are still other decisions that agencies make that might make use of these analyses. So it's not just regulatory authority. I also feel like this maybe goes into the next question, which is sometimes the scope of in a specific agency is bigger or smaller than the geographic area, but then also, no one agency is going to address the cumulative impacts that are going to come out of these analyses. But I feel like the point is that we want to use these analyses to better our decision making and to always work towards improving and trying to ensure, no further harm and sort of prioritizing improvements where there can be. So I guess I'm feeling like there's a lot of use in these analyses, even if they don't always perfectly match a given decision, to at least guide action, if that makes sense. And that might kind of address a lot of these, that it doesn't always have to, the analysis can be useful, even if it's not 100% matched to the specific question at hand.
Thanks, Dominique. Yeah, I think that language would be useful. We'll go Kelly, and then Trisha, I think I saw your hand up for a second. We'll go to you if you still have a thought.
For number 5 on the components, some components making sense for centralization versus action specific. I guess I was thinking the cost benefit analysis. It seems like that would be an extremely difficult project without a decision being considered. And there are cases where agencies have to include cost benefit analysis in rulemakings. I think it's a different question whether the scope that an agency uses in a cost benefit analysis currently is appropriate, but the cumulative impacts assessment makes a lot of sense to me as something that could be centralized. The cost benefit analysis, I'm struggling to understand what that would look like as something that was centralized versus decision related. And then this is just because we are not public health expert agent, a public health expert agency, but I'm not clear if a health impacts assessment is maybe a subset of a cumulative impacts assessment, or how distinct those two things are. So those were, yeah. But I think my main comment is kind of on the cost benefit piece and whether that really fits here or not.
Kelly, I'm really glad you kind of raised that first question about the cost benefit analysis, because this was something we struggled with as staff in the earlier draft, and really in putting this together is, I think you're right, as far as we can tell, that like a cost benefit analysis requires an action to analyze, right? You have to understand what the action is in order to understand its costs and benefits. So, the type of broad regional scale analysis is really hard to understand how it fits in. So we were very close to moving that section to the bike rack in this draft when the task force came to more consensus around doing a centralized analysis instead of a case-by-case analysis, though there's been a lot of really great work and discussion by task force members in the past in fleshing out what a good cost benefit analysis can look like. So we did ultimately leave it in, but I think we would really welcome feedback from other task force members on should that section still appear when you next see this draft at the October meeting, because we've been uncertain how to address that as staff, given that really most of the discussion about the cost benefit analysis happened in really the April task force meeting, where it wasn't clear that the centralized approach was the way the task force was going to go. So we would really welcome feedback there.
Okay.
Robin, I saw you come off mute for a second. I wasn't sure if you.
Yeah, I tried to come off mute. This is Robin. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, I was just gonna tack on to what Joel was saying, is I think that the equity analysis informs the cost benefit analysis that agencies do when they are attacking a particular decision, right, or evaluating, right? The equity analysis will give us the lens to look at the cost benefit analyses we already do through equity and what impacts those might have. It's not part of the equity analysis. It informs the cost benefit analysis. It informs the cost and it informs the benefits to the communities of the potential agency action, I guess, is where I understood how it would work together with cost benefit analysis.
Robin, thank you for that. And I think that aligns with what we just saw in the chat from Colin Tom, one of the members of the public who's with us. So maybe as a solution to propose there, we can move kind of most of the details of like what would go into a cost benefit analysis, because like we have really quite granular detail on some of it to the bike rack, but sort of note that while the equity analysis itself wouldn't analyze the costs and benefits of a specific action, it should be applied by agencies when doing their cost benefit analyses and really provide an incredibly rich source of data about both sides of the equation, costs and benefits, when thinking about things like health costs as well as benefits that could have the distribution of benefits to a community as well. So does that sound okay to the task force members as what we do in the next draft?
And if so, if you could just do like a thumbs up, maybe. Okay, seeing a few thumbs up, thank you. And Kelly, to your other question about cumulative impacts analysis versus a health impact assessment, I mean, from my understanding is that, the assessment would be done on existing environmental conditions, and then like a cumulative impacts analysis would be on, maybe projects that have not been conducted yet. So it's kind of like doing an assessment on something that already exists versus an analysis, a projection of something that, it could potentially happen. So that's kind of a distinction. And I welcome other public health folks to chime in if you feel that I did not describe that well. Others have thoughts on answers to any of these questions, and I think we answered, quite a few of them, just the general conversation that we had. But, any other elaborations on providing more specificity to this section by answering some of these questions? Okay, not hearing much. So let's move on. Okay, we'll move on to our cumulative impacts. So I did want to, again, kind of go through these relatively quickly. And I guess I'll just put these all on the table for just equal discussion, and we can move through these sections however folks want to talk about them. But as was indicated in the intro, these sections are broken down by what has been identified as what the task force wants to include. So we have cumulative impacts, the cost benefit analysis, the health impact assessment, and then the identifying solutions. And so these correspond with the different sections: A on cumulative impacts, B on the cost benefit analysis, C on health impacts assessment, and then identifying solutions. So any folks want to elaborate on any of these sections further, or if there's language in here that's concerning to you that you want to flag. And again, I'm going to just scroll up back to section A, and feel free to kind of utilize your own copy that is in the chat to kind of read through this on your own time.
Lubna, one thing I would share about it, I don't know if it belongs in this section necessarily, although maybe it does, but anytime I'm talking with, folks within CDPHE, right, because we've got this like, okay, we want to make sure that what the recommendations that come out are implementable, right, and are things that we can really take action on and understand how to do. And I often get the question, like, it often leads to conversation around what do we mean by cumulative impacts, right? I think, and I think we as a task force have talked about that a number of times also. Is it cross media? Is it across time? Is it different things? And so I'm not saying that the task force needs to define cumulative impacts, but I think it's important that we flag how important it is for and like if the legislature is to take action, for example, and they're going to use the term, that they be really clear about what they intend and what they mean by it, so that agencies really understand like what they are tasked with doing, like what the expectation and intention is of what they're looking at when they're looking at cumulative impacts.
Thanks, Trisha. So are you suggesting that maybe there's some like defining that happens at the beginning of this section to make it really clear?
No, more like we make it clear that it needs to be defined by someone.
Okay.
Whether that's the legislature or someone else.
Yeah, thanks for that further clarity. Kelly.
I think this was included within the EJ coordinating entity, but I just envision as agencies are figuring out how to apply this analysis, we'll need training. Staff might need training on areas that they've not traditionally operated on. Much of our role is economic regulator, but there are examples of how the equity analysis could be used on, prioritizing investments in electric vehicle infrastructure in communities where there's vehicle-related air quality issues. And so we might be winding up in cases where we're being asked to draw conclusions around causation and the decision that we haven't had, hasn't traditionally been something that we've dealt with. And so making sure that there's some resourcing and capacity for training of staff on how to use the tool would be really important, I think.
And Kelly, where would you like to kind of put that in terms of like that language about training?
Might make sense in the how centralized equity analyses should be applied. I was looking at the question on 3.2, how should an agency that does not have regular authority to address components of the analysis incorporate it, but actually including that concept might be best in B.
Thank you. I think Kelly means 2B, not 3B, Lubna, but I got it added there. So thank you for clarifying. I was wondering the same thing. So thank you.
Thanks, Kelly. Any others have thoughts on these 4 sections, A, B, C, and D: cumulative impacts, the cost benefit analysis, the health impacts assessment, and identifying solutions?
Well, I don't know who can provide this kind of clarity or, exactly the origin of the health impacts assessment section, but it's fairly short. And, you know, it strikes me that more clarity would be really helpful in really understanding the scope and the level of analysis that the task force is recommending for this. Like, and then a couple of other things that folks who do health impacts assessment in our shop flagged were like needing some, like, it's hard to tell right now, like, how would uncertainty be handled in the health impacts assessment, you know, by the entity that is doing it. For example, unknown exposures, highly elevated exposures for workers, and indoor air exposures. We can provide these in some more comments, but we just kind of flag that fleshing that out a little bit might be helpful.
Yeah, thanks, Tricia. And I think a lot of, I think this initial idea came from our conversation with the Chicago Department of Public Health and Environment when they came to present at some of our earlier meetings about the recycling facility they presented on, and they kind of talked about how they conducted a health impact assessment and how, you know, that was beneficial to the disproportionately impacted community in that area. Do others have thoughts on like wanting to elaborate on this language and how they would want that language to appear? And, you know, if not, one thing that we could do as staff is kind of go back through those notes and just see if there's anything that kind of resonates with what the task force is talking about in terms of providing specificity around understanding the scope that we could kind of include in here.
Can
Yeah.
I add just adding cultural and trauma sensitivity when it comes to health and impact analysis, literally being culturally sensitive to language barriers, trauma sensitive to already known impacts in their health or safety that's already going on. So adding that in some type of term there.
Yeah, thanks, Renee. You're always quick to remind us of including that language in like several of these sections. And so, yeah, recognizing the importance of inserting that in.
Thank you, Boo.
And can I build on that, Renee, because that's such an important point. And I wonder if that might be another term where, like, if we provided a little bit like more examples of what that means, then the audience who gets this will really understand like what we're looking for in terms of like trauma sensitive data and information and analysis, because it's so important.
Renee, I don't want to put you on the spot, but do you have some sort of examples of what that might look like to Trisha's question? I worry, you know, as staff, we have a range of expertise, right? My background is in air quality, Lebanon's background is in public health and water quality, but you know, we might not always know all the examples that you're thinking of. So if there's kind of like specific things as like practices that you would recommend, it would be great to know so that we can build that in here.
Sure. Honestly, just things that I've seen in grassroots spaces when you're taking data, being mindful of your actual surveillance. So when it's even race, ethnic background, that you include other cultural identities that are known are living in the space and immigrant communities where it's not just all Latino or all Indigenous or all American Indian, like actually asking and specifying which tribes are you from, which spaces are you from? So immediately knowing early on are certain forms of projection and bias that might not be included in certain spaces. That's how the census honestly messes it up. And then being mindful also to, if there's already known trauma, not going to the same community, like having a form of consistent database or documentation, even if it's video or qualitative data. and being mindful about that the same communities aren't testifying on the same trauma that they're dealing with and then coming back and having to replay it. They have to be able to speak on it once, and then if they can have some type of a consistent database to say, this is also happening to my neighbor, this is also happening to this is also happening to another space, that they can help you develop that type of community where there's been a gap with that community member, and then consistently also be compensated, be able to be brought involved in the process. Other things that where you're leaving out certain, not just you, but like just over state and federal agencies overall, might be leaving out their forms of trauma where you see the specialization that's going on in their community too. If any of that made sense, sorry. Because that's just grassroots level stuff that I've been seeing.
Thank you, that's really helpful. And I didn't capture it all in my margin comment, but I know Morgan got more of it in her notes and in her notes document, sorry, and we'll obviously listen to the recording. So it's really helpful for us as staff to kind of hear that list of examples. So thank you.
Thanks, Renee. Anybody else have further thoughts on the health impact assessment or other any of these other sections?
Sorry for a quick add too. We also work with Indigenous and immigrant communities as well. We're being mindful about how prior rulemaking or permitting has pushed communities away, even through like the era of Trump. Immigrant communities are often very afraid to be able to be involved, even in state and federal agencies, because of other issues, which leaves them out of their actual health access and rights in the space. So being mindful about what information you also share, that communities also build certain level of trust to be able to be involved in that process should also be key. So also seeing those forms of trauma in institutions is also a form of sensitivity. Sorry to also add last minute.
Thanks, Renee. That additional detail is helpful. Yeah, Kelly.
On D, the identifying solutions, are you all envisioning that it would be like once the analysis, the centralized analysis is performed, and then there would be sort of a generic assessment of cross-state opportunities to improve outcomes? Is that kind of what you're getting at? Because I think it can just get sort of tricky when a third party is saying X agency has jurisdiction to do Y and fix this problem. But I think like generalized recommendations could be helpful because agencies could find their role within that. I wasn't sure if anybody has more specifics on the task force for what they were looking to see there.
Any thoughts from our task force members on that?
While folks are thinking, I would say, this is a great point for task force members to weigh in or think about what you might want to see coming into the October meeting, or for members of the public who are listening now to provide comment when you submit your written comments on Friday. What we have here on the page is basically just what we've heard as staff come up in past meetings, and there really hasn't been much detail on this point, which as Kelly noted, is a really, really important idea. But in similar to the health impact assessment, where it's an important idea that's been raised, but there hasn't been a lot of detail, right? So, these are the exact types of things, if you think back to Lubna's kind of framing statements at the beginning of the meeting, where we would really value, if it's not, kind of off the cuff today, folks putting on their thinking caps and pondering it and coming to the October meeting with specific ideas, or members of the public providing specific ideas and comment, because the more detailed there is, the easier it will be for task force members to understand, and you all to vote on final ideas at the final meeting in November. And of course, for ultimately, if the recommendations are adopted by the task force, for your audiences, the legislature, the governor's office, specific agencies, to actually implement the recommendations. So I feel like we keep beating the drum of we need more detail, but that's why it's really important, especially for ideas like this that are less well fleshed out.
So I'll let folks kind of marinate on that in terms of the identifying solutions section. I do kind of just want to zoom out for a second and just consider, I guess, Kelly's idea in the chat as well of instead of providing more detail around the health impact assessment, having it potentially be a component of the cumulative impacts assessment, cumulative impacts analysis. So I just wanted to kind of gauge how folks thought about that, and this would potentially change this section significantly, and I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, but we are looking at 4 key components right now that the task force has identified. We have looked at moving this cost benefit analysis to the bike rack. And so it seems like there's a lot of emphasis here on the cumulative impacts analysis. And so then, thoughts on like these being subcomponents of that, instead of having them broken out into different sections, meaning that, the primary component that we would be focusing on for the equity analyses would be this cumulative impact analysis. But, it would consist of potentially including a health impact assessment as well as identifying solutions. So just kind of looking at some restructuring here.
I think this just goes back to that element of the experts in each particular field need to make sure that they're heading up those correct portions of the project. So, I get that the AQCD can't be consulted by every single project that affects air, but if the AQCD if our recommendation is the AQCD in their rulemaking creates a standard baseline assessment for cumulative impact studies done that have an effect on air quality, then there's a standard baseline that's created, right? And they will be consulted and they can say, oh, use a standard baseline, or they can say, oh, this is more meaningful and we want to add a couple different things. There has to be interagency communication and cooperation on this. Otherwise, you're asking non-experts to be experts, and that's if you don't. I just don't think that works. So I think a big component of this has to be how we're going to recommend that the agencies take steps. And I get that they haven't done it in the past. We got to stop talking about the past. We got to start talking about what we can do to change the future and make sure that they are communicating. Because I think without that, you're looking at things that just aren't going to be feasible from a time or accuracy standpoint, unless you have the experts chime in on that.
Yeah, thanks, Tyson, for kind of making sure that we're rooted in, feasibility and application of these recommendations. So, there is a decent amount of public health expertise on this task force. And so just as staff, I think one of the things that I just mentioned is really restructuring this section and really not focusing on 4 different components, but really a major component of a cumulative impacts analysis. and having these be the health impact assessment and identifying solutions be couched under that. So we'll go ahead with that idea because I'm not hearing any pushback on kind of that just general, I think, and I think it is in alignment with the conversations that we have been having about an emphasis on a cumulative impacts analysis. And I don't know that we would need to break it down into these different components. So unless others feel otherwise, we'll go ahead and restructure that way.
I would just keep the cost benefit analysis in there that you have to, especially as we're talking about, massive infrastructure upgrades that are ultimately could have an improvement on health. How are those things gauged? We have to keep all that in mind. I don't think you can get rid of that in its totality.
So Tyson, are you saying you don't support kind of the direction that happened before or earlier of removing the cost benefit analysis as something that doesn't really make sense in the framework of a centralized analysis, and instead agencies using the the equity analysis to inform the cost benefit analyses they do for individual decisions? Or are you saying that you do support that option of agencies should use the sort of extensive data that is gathered through the centralized equity analysis to inform the cost benefit analyses they do for specific decisions?
Yeah, but when Lubna just explained it, she said she's going to put the health impacts and solutions portion underneath the cumulative impacts. I was just saying, make sure the cost and benefit analysis is also included in that cumulative impacts analysis piece.
Okay, I think that is a little different than what we were talking about earlier, where so Kelly raised the point of how do you analyze costs and benefits when you're just doing an assessment of basically environmental health risks in a region, but there's no specific project in question. So the cost benefit analysis came up as something that the task force developed really a lot of detail on in the April and I think maybe June meetings before you all honed in on the idea of doing a centralized analysis. And it's really hard to understand what that would look like when there isn't a like an actual decision on the table, right? So if we're just looking at what is the cumulative environmental health risk posed by air, water, soil pollution in southeastern Pueblo, there's no decision to analyze the costs and benefits of, right? It's not, should there be just to should we accelerate the process of cleaning up the Colorado Smelter Superfund site to reduce lead exposure in that region, which would come with its own costs and benefits, right? So it's hard to kind of understand how those two concepts fit together. And Kelly, I don't know if you or others who were part of that discussion earlier want to weigh in, but I think that's why we thought our direction was to move that to the bike rack. But if we need further discussion about the cost benefit analysis should stay in as part of this analysis, would love to hear about that and also kind of hear how that would work in the scope of a centralized analysis.
Well, I think from the lens of public information, right, we're trying to create a cumulative data set in effect so that people can make informed decisions on a variety of things, right? I mean, this is going to be applicable to pretty much anything that has an impact on health, environments, welfare, in any disproportionately impacted community across the state. So I don't see how that. I guess I just don't see how that is irrelevant in that scope of things when you're trying to make sure that everybody understands what is actually going on. So, yeah, I mean, yeah, I do disagree with that, but again, it's kind of like, you asked, do I have any issues with it? That's kind of where I don't understand how the complete removal of it is relevant in the way that this is really going to work. It's so broad. There's going to be a lot of instances where that's going to be a necessary part of understanding the totality of the data set in front of you.
Do others have thoughts on what Tyson is proposing? And just to kind of like recap, we have kind of two different schools of thought here amongst the task force members present, that some are suggesting that the cost benefit analysis doesn't make sense to be included as kind of this generic construct as we're talking about the equity analysis. And so we had initially talked about moving this section to the bike rack, but Tyson is suggesting that this should be in because this would be an important component of the equity analysis to consider cost and benefits. Do others besides Tyson and Kelly have thoughts on this?
And Kelly, please feel free to weigh in. I was trying to paraphrase your comments earlier, but I obviously may have left things out or not caught some of the nuances or totally gotten it wrong what you were trying to say.
Yeah, I'm doing a lot of speculation on how the commission could apply the type of equity analysis we're talking about, because, I hate to keep repeating it, but just the public health considerations are not ones that we've had that expertise, but like if a utility is filing an energy efficiency plan, that's, usually that comes with a cost effectiveness assessment. Like it is cost effective for purposes of ratepayer dollars, that there's going to be more benefits from the efficiency investments than there will be cost to ratepayers from making those investments. And that's usually broader than economic. It's got a societal benefit factor in it. And so we do see cost benefit in that type of decision, but the cumulative impact assessment from the equity analysis might get factored in terms of where investments are made or the impact they could have on health factors. But again, I'm very much speculating on how this all might come together. But to me, the cost benefit comes with the decision. That's my understanding of the typical, definition of what a cost benefit analysis is. I'm not sure how you would construct a cost benefit test when you're looking at the environmental and public health factors as they are cumulatively impact a region. So yeah, I'm not sure I understand what the alternative would be to like what the function would be of keeping it in this case, I guess.
And I guess that's my question. I guess that's where I'm confused, because when I think of a cost benefit analysis, I think of exactly what you just said, which is where you're looking at, how for instance, you're using a new utility or something that is going to, have so much savings of wasted energy, wasted emissions, various different benefits that would contribute to cleaner air, cleaner water, things of that nature. But as we're talking about the cumulative impacts, I mean, this is really going back to the cumulative impact of all of these are going to be done pretty much on a project basis. I mean, I get that we're centralizing it, but when it comes to the use of it, everything's going to be used. And what our recommendation is what you should be using to make your decision. So I would want to make sure that all agencies are using a cumulative analysis that includes cost benefit analysis, that includes health impact analysis, that includes equity analysis, to ensure that all the data is necessary is there for decisions to be made. And if if I'm not thinking through that correctly, please help me understand that. I just don't know how those things get separated.
Tyson, could I offer a perspective?
Yeah.
So the reason I don't understand how we would include the cost benefit in the centralized equity analysis is because the centralized equity analysis is community focused. So it's like, what is going on in this community? What are the pollution impacts? What are the health issues? What are the jobs issues? What's the historical burden on the community that like helps an agency, right, in using that analysis to understand the impact of its decision on that community? So will an agency's decision add more costs to a community, and costs being health impacts, right? Emissions and pollution impacts, jobs impacts, all those impacts, or will it add more benefits? Because decisions are likely to add some of both. But you can't put a cost benefit analysis in the centralized equity analysis because you can't decouple the cost benefit analysis from the action, right? But the centralized equity analysis tells us like, where is this community today? What are the factors impacting it? And then an agency uses it by saying, okay, how do my actions impact these factors and how will they affect the community? And as part of that, they're doing a cost benefit analysis of their action. Does that like help at all? Sort of try to explain at least how I see the difference. So like an error,
and I think
the
maybe
error decision would in a
my version of a cost benefit analysis is not strictly financial. So I would, I think that's where my differences lie. And
no, I think mine's not either. It's not. Its benefits include like health outcomes, right? And traffic patterns. And, those are benefits. And maybe they're quantifiable, but they're not, strictly financial, right? But it's just, how do you do a cost benefit analysis? Like, of what are you evaluating the costs and benefits if you do it in the centralized equity analysis? I guess is what I don't understand. Your suggestion.
Yeah, could I maybe propose an analogy and see if this helps, Tyson? So I know you work a lot on kind of oil and gas issues on federal lands, which is an area that I also used to work in a lot. So I apologize to everyone to go kind of deep in jargon, but one way of viewing the centralized equity analysis is it's really similar to a Bureau of Land Management resource management plan or RMP, where it's thinking about like all kinds of industries, all kinds of impacts, all kinds of media for a whole area. So for like for a resource management plan, and I'll just say for interpreters when I say RMP, that is what I mean. So folks following along in Spanish know when they use that acronym. So for an RMP, there's no specific decision that's like being authorized, right? So we aren't, the Bureau of Land Management isn't saying like, we're going to approve this specific oil and gas well, in this location through that decision. They're just looking at impacts throughout a region. But later, the Bureau of Land Management does make that decision about that specific gas well, sort of both, well, it makes two decisions, as you know, right? The actual lease and then the permit, the application for permit to drill, or APD is the acronym I'll use, that actually authorizes that to go forward. So at the APD stage, exactly what the project is. Okay, it's going to be a gas well, it's going to have this associated infrastructure, we need an access road, we need a pipeline. And at that APD stage, you can do a cost benefit analysis. You can actually calculate like what are the costs and benefits of putting this gas well and associated infrastructure at this specific location. And at that stage, the Bureau of Land Management pulls all kinds of data from the resource management plan, the RMP, where it did like much broader scale analysis and figures out how that applies. So I think that approach is kind of what Kelly and Robin are proposing of using the centralized equity analysis, the RMP equivalent, to sort of inform case-specific decisions like an APD later, and saying that really the data from the centralized equity analysis could inform a cost-benefit analysis at that later stage. So again, the APD stage in the analogy. So I hope that maybe helps make sense. Maybe that only makes sense to me, and it doesn't help. But I guess, Tyson, a question for you is, do you think that there's data or types of things that we're missing in the cumulative impacts analysis that would be needed to like inform that later stage decision? Because what we don't want to do is cut this section and leave out a key recommendation that says like, in that cumulative impacts analysis, you need to be thinking about X so that we can actually do effective cost benefit analyses at that later stage.
I would say that cleared it up, but we do have, what do you call it? Economic analyses that we have to include with our resource management plan. So I apologize, but that's kind of what prompted me to say, hey, this is, it kind of needs to be not just completely left out. I think this is something that I'm fine, tabling. I'm not comfortable getting rid of it just to get rid of it, because I still don't understand how it doesn't impact it. But I'm fine with moving on. That's fine, and it'll always be in the parking lot or whatever. I'll look into that a little further so we can resolve it on a shorter term.
Thank you, Tyson. I appreciate that. And in hearing you say that helps. All we're trying to do as staff is figure out what do we need to do to get you all in a good shape in October. So that tells me one of the things we should do is look at something like a resource management plan and the types of economic analyses that are included with those, so that we can then make sure that that type of information is sort of listed in the cumulative impact analysis at least. So we'll go ahead and do that so you can kind of see that at the October meeting.
I appreciate that.
I wonder if another solution, and this is just kind of me from what I'm hearing, is that we can kind of propose these as sequential components with the cumulative impacts analysis, including like a health impact assessment and identifying solutions as kind of like a step one. And then the cost benefit analysis would follow. Because, I'm hearing
when applicable or whatever.
Sorry, Tyson, what was the last thing you said?
Oh, just like when applicable. Like it may not apply to everything, but when it is applicable, it should be included just from a data information.
All right, I have to get to a meeting.
Right. So, it being something that's part of the centralized equity analysis, but does that make sense to folks? Like there being like the major component being focusing on cumulative impacts, potentially including a health impact assessment and being solutions oriented. And then that would kind of dictate the cost benefit analysis. Like that information would then feed into a cost benefit analysis is kind of what I'm gathering through public health lens in what I was hearing kind of Robin and Kelly mention, that it's kind of impossible to do the cost benefit analysis until the cumulative impact analysis has been conducted. Does that make sense to folks? Yeah, Kelly, go ahead.
So are you looking at like adjusting B on how the centralized equity analysis should be applied? And it would be like agencies have discretion to apply equity analyses, which could include adjustments to cost benefit tests or something like that in appropriate ways. I think it would, you know, the cost benefit time test would take some thinking through for us, because we do have certain statutes that inform some of the cost benefit tests that are used in certain contexts. But I think if you're, again, talking about like decisions that impact, was it environmental health and public health, then there's a universe that we could be considering. I don't know that that was a helpful comment or not, but I'm trying to understand how that would fit together in my work.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure I understood your comment, Kelly, about, yeah, what I was proposing is that we do like that like a cumulative impacts analysis would happen first, and then a cost benefit analysis would happen sequentially, like later, based on the cumulative impact analysis. But I don't know if that makes sense to folks.
I think I'm still trying to put it into the framework of agency decisions, like there being a specific decision. So maybe that's not the direction you were going in, as kind of a balancing, but okay.
Okay, any others have thoughts or want to provide clarity on this section before we as staff kind of go back and try to, we'll kind of sift through the notes and think of a good way to structure this that incorporates, especially the feedback that Kelly, you and Tyson have provided. Okay, I am going to go ahead and move us on to our final section of the equity analysis, which is on setting thresholds. So I just want to flag that this was moved to the bike rack because it has been discussed, but there wasn't much detail about it so far. And during the last equity analysis subcommittee meeting, we asked for feedback on all the questions that had been raised by public commenters, and no task force members provide any feedback in response to the questions. And these questions are kind of, there's plenty of them essentially on the last page of this. So page 10, you'll see this series of questions. And so, you know, a lot of folks have, we've been hearing a lot of concerns, a lot of questions raised around the idea of thresholds. And so at the very least, we would really like for task force members to brainstorm some responses to these questions that are listed here in the document, just to provide like some sufficient guidance to future legislators or agency staff that would be implementing this recommendation. So, you know, I don't want to go through and read all of these questions to you, but I do welcome you all to kind of read what is on the screen. And if you have feedback on some of these questions, that is very much welcome. And again, so just to kind of reframe, we are talking about thresholds, the concept of incorporating thresholds into equity and cumulative impacts analyses. And so we're still trying to figure out the details about how the thresholds would be set, who would set them, you know, what the pollutants the thresholds would be for, and how the thresholds would relate to the equity and cumulative impact analysis. So we are kind of hearing this, hey, we should have thresholds be a part of the equity analysis. But further than that, in terms of exactly what that would look like in the details, we just have this list of questions that we are really looking for you task force members to provide some answers to as we discuss it further. So I'm going to go ahead and just be quiet while you all kind of read through some of these questions, and just pause to see if there's any thoughts.
Lebna, this is Trisha. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, we can hear you.
So at CDPHE, there's a number of regulatory.
Trisha, you are cutting out now. I could hear you initially, but your audio is not clear anymore.
That get our authority from.
Trisha, could you go back and start over? We couldn't really hear how you were introducing the topic. I think you were talking about CDPHE and the idea of thresholds, but we didn't really get past that. Okay, I think.
Yeah, and is the audio more stable now?
It is. Yeah, it's fine right now. Yep. Okay. You were stable for a second, but then it looks like you're muted. So I'm not sure if you want to elaborate.
I think she may have dropped off and is going to hop back on.
Okay. Okay.
I have a couple. Oh.
Yeah, go ahead, Renee.
Just certain ones that I'm reading now, specific pollutants for consideration for a threshold. And didn't the EPA also have like certain pollutants where we're like in spaces like Commerce City, benzene and others that can already be recommended in that space? So we can see those that we can build off of, and then where they're also starting to be more recommendations or higher or more pollutants in that space. So there's already like database and information there too, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, thanks, Renee. And I think that's one of the things that we need to hear from task force members of like, would you like to use existing thresholds that are provided by the EPA, for example? That is definitely a route that we can go. We just need to get that specificity from you all.
For me, yes.
Thanks. Robin?
Hi. Let me lower my hand. It's like chaos here right now. I think for the air division in particular, right, when to the pollutants Renee was discussing like certain air toxics, you know, I think it's my agency's sense is that House Bill 1244 spoke to this last session and has already funded the air division and the health department's toxicology and environmental epidemiology office to develop health-based standards based on, in part, like EPA's health guideline values for specific areas. And so, you know, if the task force proceeds with like certain thresholds, you know, it shouldn't be duplicative of work the legislature did last session, right? Which is direct a timeline and a process for setting thresholds of toxics that are, you know, that the air division needs to target in permitting, right? What and you know, there's other pollutants, for example, and this is in one of the bullet points below, right, which are NAAQS, National Ambient Air Quality Standards, which EPA sets, and those are thresholds, right, against which the air division evaluates proposed actions in permitting already. And, you know, setting like a separate NAAQS other than EPA, like a whole attainment program based on a different NAAQS, is not going to be a little challenging, but a very lot challenging. Not to say that we shouldn't do hard things. We should definitely do hard things. That's why we're here. But is this like the place to focus, given all of the work going on in this space already, like especially coming out of the air toxic spill last session, at least as it pertains to air, right? I think that's where the air division comes in. It's like we already have thresholds for NAAQS that relate to permitting. We're developing and evaluating health-based thresholds for toxics coming out of session and how those might relate to permitting. What else, are we really talking about here?
Robin, I'm really glad you used that example, because once again, I sometimes feel like I hear task force members in my mind as we as staff try to sift through the comments, read through our notes, and bring you in another draft. But that was sort of the exact thought process that I had when we were looking through comments and figuring out, does this go in the bike rack, does this go in the recommendations, is that I think a lot of the discussions about the thresholds happened again in earlier task force meetings, so the subcommittee meeting and then the April subcommittee or full task force meeting, if I'm remembering, prior to the air toxic spill passing. And so, trying to think it through, to your point, there's sort of three buckets of air quality or of air pollutants, right? There are the criteria pollutants that already have the national ambient air quality thresholds. There are air toxics that will now have thresholds under House Bill 22. I'm going to get the number wrong, but the new Air Toxics Act. And then there are greenhouse gases, for which there are very important thresholds that have been identified by scientists at a global level, but there's sort of no way for us as one state to control those thresholds, right? And then in the water quality space, there are total maximum daily loads, also known as TMDL. I'll use that acronym just for simplicity, but I'm kind of explaining what it means quickly for our interpreters, that already exist for specific water bodies. So it was a little unclear for me as staff to the task force how we could sort of what specificity folks on the task force were referring to, or like which types of pollutants there aren't already these thresholds for. And I guess one question I had as I was trying to think that through is what is maybe like what the members of the task force who are suggesting the thresholds we're trying to get at is that the considerations of those thresholds that already exist or will be set for in the case of air toxic should be part of the cumulative impacts analysis and sort of guiding, sort of be provided as part of the guiding principles against with, sort of like existing impacts are prepared. And that's somewhat similar to what happens in some cases under the National Environmental Policy Act. I don't think that's a perfect solution, right? But if you look at a National Environmental Policy Act analysis, it will often say like, okay, how does air quality in this area compare to those national ambient air quality standards? So I kind of have this back and forth in my mind of like, is that what we're talking about? Are we talking about comparing to existing standards as part of the analysis, or is it really talking about like setting standards? But there definitely was discussion about setting standards, so I don't want to cut that out, but that's kind of what we've been grappling with as staff.
Well, and I just add, like, I think this really came off the bike rack at Ian's suggestion, and I don't think he's here today, right? So, I don't think we should put it back on the bike rack until we hear from him. But my takeaway sort of when I take myself out of my wedded to the thresholds concept and I read these bullet points and I'm like, what are we actually getting at here? Is the underlying issue is agency authority to restrict operations or impose conditions on operations in order to, and I'm going to steal from COGCC language here, right? Avoid, minimize, or mitigate impacts, right? And so the centralized equity analysis tells the agency about the community. The proposed action tells us, like the action before the agency tells us what the impacts, right, are going to be on the community. that last missing linchpin is making sure agencies have the authority and, I mean, to be fair, the direction, right, to impose conditions on the regulated community to address those impacts up to it and potentially including denial of the permit itself in certain cases. And, you know, I'm not going to get out in front of things for the air division. I know we're looking hard at what is our authority already and do we have it and will we need more to do things like that. But I think that's where I understand the concern is when I read these bullet points and take out the concept of numeric thresholds. It's right, using the centralized equity analysis to inform conditions upon the operation of sources of pollution. Anyway, that's how I read it. But again, Ian's not here, so he can't like gut check me. But if others, you know, who have their own thoughts or are familiar with his thinking might have input, I think it would be interesting to hear that.
Thanks, Robin. Trisha, you might be back, and I know that you were going to chime in about thresholds. I wasn't sure if you are back online and able to share.
I am back. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, thanks, and sorry about that. And sorry I missed part of the conversation. I'm not sure if the comments even need to be made, given kind of what I did here. I was just going to kind of weigh in and say with where we are with, I mean, that setting thresholds is something, at least for our agencies, like it already exists, right? Like we're governed by the federal government and they have set a lot of thresholds for our programs already. And then we have authority and direction to be working on additional threshold setting, and that these things are incredibly complex, right? Like they take years and years. So I was not supportive of let's set new thresholds for those same pollutants, but it doesn't sound like that's the direction we're heading anyways. It sounds like we probably need Ian in the conversation anyways to talk about whether or not this can go back on the bike rack, or if the conversation needs to pivot to something less about should we set more numeric thresholds, and instead should we talk about how existing thresholds and standards can be used in different ways, or should different authorities be given for what can be done if standards are being exceeded.
Yeah, thanks, Trisha, for providing that clarity about, you know, what was meant in terms of introducing thresholds into the equity analysis to begin with. And yes, agree that I think Ian would be a crucial person to have in this conversation, considering we pulled this off the bike rack and back into the recommendations for his suggestion. And I think that we can definitely elaborate on this and continue to have this conversation at the October meeting. This actually might be a good place to start when we're talking about the equity analysis, considering you know, this might just need to, this section might just need more clarity. But with that said, I do want to see, you know, I do want to give folks an opportunity to kind of read through some of these other questions and, you know, see if you have any initial thoughts or responses. And I think another important component to really think about is like how these thresholds would fit into the equity analysis exactly. You know, getting a little bit more clarity on that. And, you know, whether they would be a part of every single equity analysis. I think those are some key questions.
Lumni will once again cut into the much needed thinking time and maybe just propose that to kind of facilitate an easier discussion at the October meeting. I think that's a great point that we could start with this as a hard concept when all the task force members are in the room. But we could potentially, instead of just having this long list of really hard questions, essentially break this current recommendation into two components. One being a discussion in part C1 that talks about the cumulative impact analysis, to be clear that that analysis should discuss the existing thresholds that have already been created by agencies and apply in an area, and talk about how, kind of to Robin's points, a new action could or could not influence, you know, either exceeding those thresholds or getting back below the thresholds, depending on what the current status is. And then move the other component of what does the agency do with that information about, you know, where a certain area is in relation to each threshold, to section 2 that talks about how agencies apply the analysis. And note, to Robin's point, you know, the idea that agencies might need to be empowered to do more than they currently can, or directed to use their existing authority to address the situation when a threshold is exceeded. I think one advantage of that is it would really narrow the conversation or the number of outstanding questions really just to the ones that I highlighted just now, because most of the really hard questions are, to Trisha's point about, like, you know, how would we actually set these thresholds, who would do it, which pollutants are we setting them for, you know, and kind of avoid needing to get tangled up in some of those questions if that's ultimately not really necessary to achieve the vision. So curious what task force members think, and Lubna, you as well as kind of the person who will be facilitating that conversation about whether that's a good option of, instead of having this as a separate standalone section, trying to build in those two concepts elsewhere, and then facilitate a conversation from there at the October meeting.
So I do think that would be good to incorporate thresholds into other sections as opposed to this being a standalone section, just to kind of have it weave into some of the other components. Joel, you were suggesting that this be, and I didn't catch, you said C1, and I wasn't sure which section you were talking about.
Sorry, I meant 1C. I meant the components of the cumulative impacts analysis. Oh my gosh, that's not even right. It's been a long 11 months of the task force, not just a long day. I meant 3A. So this section of the cumulative impacts analysis. Sorry. So talking about what is included in that analysis.
Okay. And so you suggested putting it in here in the cumulative impact section, and then also another section.
That's right. So the idea would be include the existing thresholds that already exist across media. So thinking about the national ambient air quality standards for air, the thresholds that will be created for hazardous air pollutants under the new law, as well as things like total maximum daily loads for water quality, as part of that cumulative impacts analysis, along with a comparison of how the area under consideration compares to that analysis. And then in section 2B above, how that centralized equity analysis should be applied, add the component of what is currently in part 4, the thresholds that Robin was getting at, talking about how agencies will be empowered to or directed to use their existing authority to sort of address any exceedances of those thresholds when applying the analysis.
So that is not what I was suggesting.
Okay, so
was not suggesting and cannot support that the centralized equity analysis would set thresholds against which agencies would evaluate a proposed action, right? agencies need to set thresholds or legislatures. Like that, if and when there are thresholds, there could be in the centralized equity analysis, like, so there are NACs, those have been set. We have those here, like that could be a part of a centralized equity analysis. But I wouldn't expect the centralized equity analysis to get ahead of House Bill 1244 on toxics, right? I wouldn't expect a centralized equity analysis to come and say, well, we looked at EPA health guideline values for this neighborhood, and it's, you know, potentially got an issue with benzene. And so to imply that an agency permit would have to conduct some sort of modeling or something against that central, right? That's exactly the program the legislature directed be created in House Bill 1244. So I think where thresholds exist in regulation, right, it could be useful to have the centralized equity analysis look at those and assess that as part of it. But I wouldn't, I guess I'm not sure I heard you say this, Joel, but I would want to make it clear that we're not talking about basically a threshold setting program by way of the centralized equity analysis, right? Like there still needs to be a regulatory process.
Yeah, Robin, what you're describing is what I was trying to say. So that's the good thing. It was a poor choice of words on my part. I meant a reference to those existing thresholds that exist in regulation or statute.
All right, thank you. I'm sorry to jump in and clarify.
Okay, I think that gives us some clarity on how we want to handle thresholds moving forward. And we can definitely weave this into the earlier sections rather than this being its own standalone. And I think there has been pretty clear consensus that we would be relying on thresholds that already exist, that have been, you know, dictated by agencies and different pieces of legislation, and that these would be used as components in the equity analysis. So I think that's pretty clear. Any others have thoughts to share on any of these questions on thresholds? Okay, well, thanks all. I think this has been a really productive conversation and has given us staff a lot of homework to kind of further refine this section as we move into the October meeting. Again, you know, we will be dedicating a large chunk of time in the October 24th meeting to the equity analysis. Again, this being, you know, the most complex section of the recommendations that really has a large footprint. So we do want to make sure that this has robust engagement at that time as well. So for our task force members, you know, I'm kind of preaching to the choir with the folks on this call right now, but if you could really, you know, read through the details of these recommendations, not that anybody here has not, I think people have been clearly very well informed by what has been written on the page, but we want you all to read all of the recommendations in a lot of detail, but please try to come with a very firm understanding of what has already been proposed on the equity recommendations in particular. An updated draft of the draft recommendations will be sent to you in advance of the meeting. So while it is beneficial to read the current draft that's on the public drive, we will be incorporating all of the public comment that we are receiving in both written format, through surveys, through meetings that we're having with people. All of that will be incorporated into an updated draft that will be sent to you by mid next week at the latest. So just please keep an eye out for that. when I send you the email kind of prepping you for the meeting and telling you that you have to read the recommendations prior to the coming to the meeting, that's really imperative, because you will not be able to participate meaningfully unless you've read through the recommendations. And if it's helpful for you all to know, you know, the recommendations, these are your words that we essentially crafted. So I feel like there's a lot of onus to make sure that we crafted what you were thinking and saying correctly. That's what we want to get to. So before we move on to public comment, I just want to zoom out here. You know, we're talking about just this entire section of the recommendations on the equity analysis in general, and environmental equity and cumulative impacts analysis, to be very clear. Are there any other thoughts or general ideas that the task force members have on this section as we're moving into the October meeting that would be helpful for us to know as your facilitators? So, you know, you saw us go through this section by section. Is there anything that task force members would like for staff to do in advance of the meeting in October on the 24th, besides kind of recrafting this and sharing it and, you know, furthering our discussion? Okay, not hearing any general ideas or thoughts. So hopefully that means that we've gotten into the details and you all feel that we've done a good job of capturing some of the ideas and that we have solid next steps. I would like to just go ahead and open it up for public comment. I know that we've had some folks that have been on the line since 2 o'clock and really would value hearing from our members of the public who have just really been engaged in the chat and yeah, have been attentive during this call. So I welcome folks to raise their hand or drop their name in the chat if they'd like to provide public comment on any aspect of what we've talked about today. Don't want to call anybody out by name, but I know there were some folks that were very active in the chat. And if you have any like further elaborations, if you've already said what you've wanted to say kind of in the chat and you've shared as much as you'd like to and feel that you've been heard, that's totally fine. But we do just encourage folks, this is an opportunity to talk directly with task force members and share any ideas or suggestions that may not be incorporated into the recommendations yet. Yeah, Stephanie, please go ahead.
Hi. I've met Lubin before. I just want to let you guys know I'm actually doing a capstone related to surveying how cumulative impacts analysis is being handled with specifically air quality in other states. I've been working. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
I've been working with Colin Tom as my preceptor and Dr. Dickinson, Catherine Dickinson as my advisor. So I'll be sending you guys an email just to try to find out from you guys what you would most want to know when I talk to other stakeholders and am doing the research on that. I will note I'm still on a learning curve with all of this, so I don't feel like I can say anything authoritatively. I do know from what I've seen so far that there's concern that the current existing thresholds may not adequately represent how cumulative mixtures impact, that they're not equitable in terms of their how they address the health of communities. And so I as to who would set those thresholds and like, is that in the scope of what this is? I don't know. But that's something I'll probably be asking about when I talk to other states, and it won't be in time for what's happening this month and end of this month, but that is something that I'll be trying to learn more about.
Thanks, Stephanie, and Colin, feel free to elaborate on that or share other points.
Thank you, Stephanie, and sorry for the noise. I'm in transit. Can I be heard okay?
Yeah, we can hear you great.
Oh, great, thank you. So it's a little bit of a moving target. It seems like the task force is discussing the recommendations at the same time the public and local governments are commenting on them. So I wanted to just make sure I understand, is anything removed from the draft that we are commenting on due Friday as of today?
Yeah, I mean, we are going to be changing some of the language. It will be updated, and the version that you see that was shared is on the public drive. I know that a lot of the comments, like margin comments and like our notes, might be hard to follow, but there will be some significant changes to this section. For example, eliminating the threshold section as a standalone section and incorporating it into others, restructuring the components of cumulative impacts. So I wouldn't say like a whole lot is being omitted, but yeah, there is some language changes that are going to be incorporated.
So if we are trying to get a final draft of comments approved, at what time should we check the drive and see, basically the status of the recommendations that these comments are upon?
Joel, go ahead.
Yeah, so Colin, the version, so draft, you should submit your comments on draft 3 of the recommendations. The reality is that because the legislature only gave us a year for this process, we've had to continue to have subcommittee meetings of the task force. While there are comment periods open, it was either that or have very short comment periods or only one comment period. And it was clear that the task force wanted as much input as possible, which is why the process was structured that way. In practice, that does mean that there are subcommittees like this one that have conversations about changes to the draft that you're commenting on. And so, that's a messy process, which we definitely recognize. And, I would certainly encourage you, if you haven't already invested a great deal of time, don't focus your comments on the 2 components that the subcommittee suggested, kind of significantly reconfiguring or removing the cost benefit analysis component and the thresholds component. But what will happen in practice is Lubna and I will still read all those comments, and if there's a comment that's on something that has changed, we'll do our best to figure out how to incorporate it into the changed way. If there's a really important question or idea on something that's been removed, and again, there's not a ton of removals happening, that is still important for the task force to consider, we'll make sure we either build that into another section of the recommendations in the next draft, or find other ways to bring it to the task force as we plan the facilitation of the October meeting. So it's a little messy, and I apologize, but that's sort of the reality of kind of the amount of time we have and how we're approaching that, because we did have to have those subcommittee meetings during the comment periods.
Yeah, that does make sense, Joel. We do understand. I just, when I did earlier in the meeting, tried to open the draft that was linked, I saw the draft, but not the comment. Is there something wrong with my setting, or do I need to make a request?
We may need to take a look at it and make sure the comments are visible. That we may have messed up a setting on our end. So thank you for flagging that.
Okay, thank you very much, and thanks for all the work that y'all have done on this. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Stephanie. Thanks, Colin. And we'll be sure to update our settings so that comments are visible. Any others have any public comment on the conversation that took place today? All right, hearing none, I am going to go ahead and propose that we adjourn early. I do want to just remind our task force members that our next meeting of the full task force is taking place in Greeley on October 24th and 25th. These are full day meetings. We will have jam-packed agendas. We will be providing you with food and refreshments and caffeine for those 2 days. But it is really imperative that all task force members show up ready to engage, having read the recommendations. And of course, we really highly encourage all task force members to attend in person. I know that we are having a hybrid meeting, and to be, really open and honest, the reason that we have these hybrid meetings is to provide flexibility, but especially flexibility for members of the public who can't attend in person. But for our task force members, it would be really meaningful for you all to be there face to face. As we saw from some of our previous meetings, especially our last meeting in Grand Junction, I think the nature of how we interact with each other and the conversations that kind of transpire are a little bit different when they do take place in person and are a little bit more hands-on. So I would really appreciate that as your board's manager if folks could confirm their attendance in person. Please feel free to let me know at your earliest convenience if you can attend in person. Final reminder that as you are planning your trip to Greeley, that you must book your hotels on your own, and then you can apply for reimbursement to make sure that those costs are covered. So I just wanted to just flag those things. If you need any help with finding a hotel or need hotel suggestions, we are happy to provide those, but we cannot book your hotel for you. You would book it on your own and then submit a reimbursement form with a receipt. But I think that covers it. Thank you so much to our interpreters who spent this meeting interpreting the entire 4 hours of it. Always very much appreciated. And we hope to see all of our task force members that were on the call today at the meeting in person in Greeley. And for the members of the public, we hope that you can continue to engage, if not in person, online. So thanks all so much for your attention and engagement, and we look forward to seeing you in 12 days.
Thanks, Labna. Thanks, everyone.